Hey guys, tonight we delve into the forbidden chronicles of the Mad King's reign, where the line between madness and prophecy blurred into something far more terrifying than history dares to remember. The hidden truths about Aerys Targaryen II, the last Dragon King, whose so-called insanity may have been the most tragic case of prophetic sight ever recorded in the Seven Kingdoms. Tonight we uncover the conspiracy that silenced a king who saw too much, knew too much, and died trying to save a realm that branded him mad. But first, in the deepest vaults beneath the citadel, where even the most learned maesters fear to tread, a discovery waits that will shatter everything you thought you knew about the fall of House Targaryen. A journal written in the Mad King's own hand, its pages stained with tears and blood, containing a prophecy so precise, so terrifyingly accurate, that those who first read it chose to bury it rather than face its implications. The journal speaks of ice and fire, of a bastard prince who would unite the realm, of dragons born from death, and of a night that would last a generation. But most chilling of all, it describes in perfect detail the very rebellion that would claim Aerys's life, written years before Robert Baratheon ever raised his warhammer in anger. How could a madman see the future with such clarity? Unless, of course, he wasn't mad at all. So before you settle in for tonight's journey into the shadows of Westeros, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into the hidden corners of our favorite worlds. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, whether you're listening to the rain in London or the desert winds of somewhere far more exotic. Now dim the lights. Maybe let the gentle hum of night sounds carry you deeper into comfort. Get wrapped up in your warmest blanket, and let's begin tonight's journey together into the forbidden archives, where truth and madness dance hand in hand. In the heart of Old Town, where the citadel's ancient towers pierce the sky like stone needles threading the fabric between earth and heaven, Master Qyburn once walked these very halls as a young acolyte, hungry for knowledge that the grey rats deemed too dangerous to pursue. But this isn't Qyburn's story, though his shadow lingers here like smoke from a long-extinguished candle. This is the story of another seeker of forbidden truths, a chronicler whose name has been deliberately erased from every record, every ledger, every whispered tale of those who once walked among the masters of the citadel. They called him simply the Archivist, and on this particular night, as autumn winds howled through the narrow streets of Old Town, like the dying breaths of summer itself, he descended deeper into the citadel's foundations than any living soul had ventured in over 50 years. The steps carved into living rock were worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, each depression a testament to the countless seekers who had walked this path before him, most never to return to tell of what they found in the darkness below. The air grew thick with the weight of accumulated years, heavy with the scent of parchment and dust, and something else, something that made his skin prickle with unease. Secrets have their own smell, you see, a particular mixture of fear and knowledge that clings to hidden places like morning mist clings to a graveyard. And these vaults, buried so deep beneath the citadel that even the rats avoided them, reeked of secrets that had been fermenting in darkness for decades. His torch, crafted from the finest Old Town oak and soaked in oil, blessed by the starry sept, cast dancing shadows on walls that had not seen light since the reign of Aerys II himself. The flame flickered and wavered as though something in the very air was trying to snuff it out, as though the darkness itself resented this intrusion into its ancient domain. But the Archivist pressed on, driven by a hunger for truth that had consumed him since the day he first learned to read, since the day he realized that history was written by the survivors, not the truthful. The corridor stretched ahead of him, like the gullet of some great stone beast, its walls lined with doors that had been sealed with both iron locks and something far more permanent. Warning glyphs carved into the stone above each threshold spoke of contents too dangerous for mortal minds, knowledge that could drive men to madness or worse. But it was the final door at the corridor's end that drew him forward like a lodestone draws iron, a door marked with the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen and sealed with 7 different locks, each crafted by a different order of Meisters, each blessed by a different faith. This was the chamber of the Forbidden King, the vault where they had hidden every record, every testimony, every scrap of evidence about the final years of Aerys Targaryen's reign that contradicted the accepted narrative of his madness. The archivist had spent 20 years tracking down rumors of this place, following breadcrumbs of whispered conversations and coded messages through the labyrinthine politics of the Citadel. 20 years of careful questions and patient research, 20 years of pretending to study acceptable topics while secretly pursuing the greatest mystery in the history of the 7 kingdoms. Why had they worked so hard to hide the truth about the Mad King? What had Aerys known that was so dangerous it required not just his death, but the systematic destruction of his memory? The locks yielded one by one to keys he had spent a fortune acquiring from sources that preferred to remain nameless. Each tumbler that fell echoed through the darkness like a death knell, like the sound of destiny finally accepting what had been denied for too long. And when the final lock clicked open, when the great iron door swung inward on hinges that groaned like souls in torment, the archivist stepped across the threshold into a chamber that would change everything he thought he knew about the Game of Thrones. The room beyond was not what he had expected. Where he had imagined chaos and destruction, the deliberate mess of hasty concealment, he found instead a space arranged with almost religious care. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, filled with books and scrolls and documents organized with the precision of a master librarian. Tables arranged in perfect rows held still more materials, each pile labeled in a hand he recognized from his years of study, the careful script of maesters who had taken their duties seriously right up until the moment they chose to betray them. But it was the center of the room that stole his breath and nearly cost him his sanity. There, on a pedestal of black stone carved with Valyrian glyphs that seemed to shift and writhe in the torchlight, lay an open book bound in leather the color of dried blood. The pages visible in the flickering flame were covered with handwriting that made his hands shake as recognition dawned. This was no copy, no transcription made by careful scribes. This was the original, written in the Mad King's own hand, the ink made from his own blood mixed with ground dragon bone and tears shed in the darkness of his final years. The page that lay open bore a date that made the archivist's heart skip a beat. The 7th day of the 7th moon, in the 280th year after Aegon's conquest, the very day that Robert Baratheon had called his banners and begun the rebellion that would destroy House Targaryen forever. But this entry, written in Aerys's increasingly erratic script, described those events with the precise detail of someone who had witnessed them personally, despite the fact that they would not unfold for 3 more years. The Bastard of Winterfell, the journal read, will be the song of ice and fire made flesh, though he will not know his true name until the world has already ended and begun again. The Dragon Queen will hatch her children in fire and blood, but she will die before she can claim the throne that is hers by right. The Golden Hand will strangle his lover beneath the bells of King's Landing, and the Wolf Maiden will watch the world burn from the seat of her ancestors. All of this I have seen in the flames that whisper truths too terrible for mortal hearts to bear. The archivist read those words again and again, his mind reeling with the implications. These were not the ravings of a madman, but the precise prophecies of someone who had seen across the barriers of time itself. Someone who had watched the future unfold in visions so clear and detailed that he could describe conversations that had never happened, battles that had never been fought, deaths that had never occurred. Unless, of course, they had all occurred, in the only way that mattered. in the realm of prophecy and possibility, where seers and dreamers walk the paths between what was and what would be. But as the archivist reached out to turn the page, to read more of these impossible truths, a sound echoed through the chamber that froze his blood in his veins. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the ancient corridor he had just traversed. Someone else was descending into these forbidden depths, someone who knew exactly where they were going and what they would find when they arrived. The Mad King's journal was not the only secret hidden in this chamber of forbidden truths, and the archivist was about to discover that some knowledge comes with a price that must be paid in blood and silence. The Game of Thrones had not ended with Aerys's death at the hands of Jaime Lannister. It had simply moved into the shadows, where those who guard the realm's most dangerous secrets continue to play for stakes higher than any iron chair. Tonight we uncover their game, and the terrible price of playing it. The footsteps that echoed through the ancient corridors belonged to Grand Maester Pycelle, though this was not the doddering old man that history would remember. This was Pycelle in his prime, sharp as Valyrian steel, and twice as dangerous, his mind still keen, despite the careful facade of harmless wisdom he wore like a comfortable cloak. He moved through the darkness with the confidence of one who had walked these paths many times before, his soft leather boots making barely a whisper against the worn stone floors. The archivist pressed himself against the cold wall, his torch extinguished with a prayer to whatever gods might protect, seekers of forbidden truths. In the absolute darkness of the deep vaults, he could hear every breath, every rustle of fabric, every careful step that brought the Grand Maester closer to the chamber where Aerys's secrets lay waiting. But Pycelle was not alone. Other footsteps followed, lighter and more cautious, the measured tread of someone accustomed to moving through shadows and keeping to the spaces between official history and uncomfortable truth. The second figure revealed himself as Lord Varys, though he bore little resemblance to the perfumed spider that courtiers would later know. Here in the depths beneath the citadel, away from the games and machinations of King's Landing, he moved with the fluid grace of water, finding its way through stone. His voice, when he spoke, carried none of the simpering affectation that would become his trademark in later years. This was Varys as he truly was, before the performance became so complete that perhaps even he forgot where the mask ended and the man began. The young seeker has found his way to the heart of things, Varys murmured, his words carrying clearly through the still air, just as we knew he would, given enough time and motivation. The question now becomes whether he possesses the wisdom to understand what he has discovered, or whether he will become another casualty of knowledge too dangerous for mortal minds to bear. Pycelle's response came as a low rumble, the sound of a man who had spent decades keeping secrets that could topple kingdoms. The boy has spent 20 years pursuing shadows and whispers. He has earned the right to learn the truth, though I fear he may not survive the learning. Few men can look upon the full scope of what we have hidden and retain their sanity. The Mad King's prophecies alone would be enough to break most minds, but what lies beyond them, what they truly represent, that is a burden we have carried in silence for too long. The archivist felt his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. These two men, pillars of the established order, guardians of official history, were speaking of the Mad King's writings as prophecies rather than the ravings of a diseased mind. More than that, they spoke as men who had not merely discovered these truths by accident, but who had been their guardians for decades, keeping them hidden from a world that was not ready to accept what they revealed. The chamber where Aerys's journal lay open suddenly blazed with light as Pycelle entered carrying a lamp that cast steady golden radiance across the carefully ordered shelves and tables. The Grand Maester moved with the reverence of a septon approaching a sacred altar, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he gazed upon the blood-red leather binding that held the Mad King's most secret thoughts. "Every time I enter this place," Pycelle said softly, "I am reminded of the night Aerys first showed me what he had seen in the flames. I was young then, newly risen to the position of Grand Maester, convinced that I understood the natural order of things. I believed in the supremacy of reason over superstition, of careful observation over wild fancy. And then this broken king, this man that every courtier whispered was touched by madness, described to me in perfect detail conversations that would take place 20 years in the future. Varys moved to stand beside the pedestal, his pale hands clasped behind his back as he gazed down at the open pages. He told you of the day Robert Baratheon would die, gored by a boar, while hunting in the woods near King's Landing. He described the sound Cersei would make when she realized her husband was beyond saving, a sound like glass breaking in an empty room. He knew the color of the wine that would flow from Robert's wounds, the specific words that Ned Stark would speak as he held his dying friend. How does a madman know such things with such precision? The Grand Maester's laugh held no humor, only the bitter acknowledgement of truths too large for comfortable acceptance. Because he was not mad, my friend. Never mad, despite what we allowed the world to believe. Aerys Targaryen was cursed with the gift of true sight, the ability to look across the barriers of time and witness events yet to unfold. The dragon blood that flowed in his veins carried with it the same power that allowed his ancestors to bind dragons to their will, the same force that built Valyria into an empire that spanned continents. The archivist listened from his hiding place with growing wonder and terror. Everything he had spent his life studying, every assumption about the nature of history and the reliability of accepted truths was crumbling around him like a castle built on foundations of sand. If Adris had truly possessed prophetic sight, if his so-called madness had been nothing more than the burden of seeing too clearly into a future too terrible to contemplate, then what did that mean for everything that had followed? Varys turned away from the journal and began pacing the length of the chamber, his movements restless with the energy of secrets long suppressed. The tragedy of Aerys Targaryen was not his madness, but his sanity. He saw the wars that would come, the suffering that would be visited upon the realm, the price that would be paid for the ambitions of lesser men. He tried to warn them, tried to prepare the kingdom for what was coming, but who listens to the warnings of a king they believe to be touched by insanity? More than that, Pycelle added, his voice heavy with the weight of decades spent keeping these truths buried. He saw his own death, knew the exact moment when Jaime Lannister would drive a sword through his back, knew the words that would be spoken, the look in the young knight's eyes as he broke the most sacred oath a man can swear. And still he tried to save them all, tried to find some way to change what he had seen, to alter the course of events that seemed fixed as surely as the movement of the stars. The chamber fell silent, except for the steady burning of the lamp and the barely audible whisper of air moving through stone passages carved before the conquest. In that silence, the archivist could almost hear the echo of other voices, other conversations that had taken place in this very room over the years. How many men had stood where he now crouched, learning truths that would remake their understanding of the world? How many had left this place forever changed, carrying the burden of knowledge that could never be shared with those who lived in the comfortable blindness of accepted history? Varys stopped his pacing and turned to face the Grand Maester, his expression grave in the lamplight. The question that haunts me, that has haunted me for 20 years, is whether we made the right choice. When we decided to let the world believe in Aerys' madness rather than accept his prophecies, when we chose to hide these records rather than risk the chaos that might follow their revelation, did we serve the realm or betray it? Pycelle moved to one of the tables laden with documents and lifted a scroll sealed with black wax, the mark of House Targaryen pressed deep into its surface. I have asked myself that same question every day since we made our choice. But consider what would have happened if we had acted otherwise. If we had proclaimed to the Seven Kingdoms that their king was not mad but prophetic, that his warnings of coming disaster should be heeded rather than dismissed, what then? Would Robert Baratheon have accepted that the rebellion he led was foretold and therefore inevitable? Would the great houses have bowed their heads and accepted that their fates were written in the flames of dragon dreams? They would have declared us all mad, Varys replied, though his voice carried little conviction. They would have said that we had been corrupted by the same madness that claimed our king, that prophecy and politics made poor companions. And perhaps they would have been right. Perhaps some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud, even when speaking them might prevent the very disasters they foretell. The Grand Maester broke the seal on the scroll and unrolled it carefully, revealing line after line of text written in the same blood-red ink that marked Aerys's journal. This is his account of the Long Night's return, written in the year of his death. He describes in perfect detail the army of the dead, the Night King who leads them, the dragons that will be needed to stand against them. He even names the boy who will unite the living against the darkness, though that boy had not yet been born when these words were written. Varys moved closer to read over the Grand Maester's shoulder, his face pale in the lamplight. Jon Snow. He writes of Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, as though he had known him personally, describes his face, his voice, the way he carries himself, the burden of command that will settle on his shoulders like a cloak woven from duty and sacrifice. How did Aerys know these things when the boy's parents had not even met? Because time is not the straight line we pretend it to be, Pycelle replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Because the dragon blood carries with it the ability to see across the barriers that separate what was from what will be. Aerys walked the paths between past and future as easily as we walk the corridors of this citadel, and what he saw there drove him to acts that seemed like madness, but were actually desperate attempts to change what appeared to be unchangeable. The archivist felt tears streaming down his face, though he could not have said whether they were tears of wonder or sorrow. To learn that the Mad King had been a prophet rather than a madman was revelation enough, but to discover that men he had respected and trusted had spent decades hiding this truth from the world was almost more than his mind could accept. How many other truths lay buried in the foundations of accepted history? How many other voices had been silenced because their warnings were too uncomfortable to hear? The two men in the chamber continued their conversation, speaking of things that would have been dismissed as fantasy by any reasonable person. They discussed prophecies that had come to pass with startling accuracy, visions that had been dismissed as delusions until events proved them true, warnings that had been ignored until it was too late to heed them. They spoke of Aerys as a man burdened by knowledge too great for any mortal mind to bear, a king whose greatest tragedy was not his madness but his sanity. As the night wore on, as the lamp burned lower and the shadows grew longer, the archivist began to understand the full scope of what had been hidden from the world. The Mad King's prophecies were not isolated ravings, but part of a vast tapestry of interconnected visions that spanned centuries and touched every corner of the known world. Aerys had seen not just the immediate future, but the long arc of history itself, the great patterns that governed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the eternal dance between ice and fire that would determine the fate of all living things. But perhaps most chilling of all was the realization that the prophecies were not finished. Hidden among the carefully preserved documents were visions that spoke of events yet to come, warnings of disasters that still awaited the unwary, promises of hope that might yet be fulfilled if the right choices were made by those who would inherit the burden of leadership. The Mad King was dead, but his visions lived on, waiting in the darkness beneath the citadel for someone brave enough or foolish enough to bring them into the light. The Game of Thrones had not ended with Robert's rebellion. It had simply entered a new phase, one where the players were not just kings and queens, but the very forces of fate itself. The revelation that burned in the archivist's mind like wildfire through dry timber was too immense for silence, too dangerous for hasty action. As Pycelle and Varys departed the hidden chamber, their voices fading into whispers and then into nothing, he remained crouched in the darkness, wrestling with the magnitude of what he had witnessed. The Mad King's prophecies were real, validated by men whose entire lives had been dedicated to the pursuit and preservation of truth. But more than that, they were incomplete, part of a vast puzzle whose final pieces remained scattered across the hidden corners of the Seven Kingdoms. When the last echo of footsteps had faded from the ancient corridors, when he was certain that he was once again alone with the secrets that had been buried beneath tons of stone and centuries of careful deception, the archivist finally emerged from his hiding place. The lamp that Pycelle had brought still burned with steady flame, casting its golden light across the blood-red journal that lay open on its pedestal of black stone. But now the pages that faced upward were different, turned by hands that had handled them with the reverence due to sacred texts. The new passage that lay revealed spoke of dragons in terms that made the archivist's breath catch in his throat. Not the great beasts that had carried the Targaryen conquerors across the narrow sea, but dragons yet unborn, dragons that would rise from death and ashes to soar above a world grown cold and dark. The handwriting, though still recognizably Aerys's, was different here, more controlled, as though the visions that inspired these particular words had come to him in moments of crystal clarity rather than the fevered dreams that seemed to characterize his other prophecies. 3 dragons will be born of fire and blood. The journal read, hatched in the flames of a funeral pyre by she whose ancestors conquered half the world. The black will be named for a carl who died too young, the gold for a brother whose crown was made of molten metal, and the greatest of them, cream and crimson, like the dawn over Vase Dothrak, will bear the name of the prince who would have been king. They will grow swift and strong, these children of ancient magic, but their destiny lies not in conquest but in salvation, not in ruling the world of men, but in defending it from the darkness that comes with winter's breath. The words seemed to shimmer on the page as though written in ink that had not yet fully dried, and when the archivist reached out to touch them, he could swear that he felt warmth radiating from the parchment itself. These were not merely words but vessels for power, containers that held within them fragments of the same force that had once bound dragons to the will of their riders. To read them was to participate in the prophecy itself, to become part of the great tapestry of fate that Aerys had witnessed in his visions of flame and shadow. But dragons alone would not be enough to face what was coming. The journal spoke of allies that would be needed, of unlikely heroes who would rise from the most unexpected places. A bastard who would prove truer than kings, a dwarf whose mind would be worth more than armies, a girl who would learn to wear faces like others wear masks, a knight whose honor would survive even death itself. Each name that appeared in the prophecy was accompanied by detailed descriptions that read like character studies written by someone who had known these people intimately, though most of them had not yet been born when the words were first set to parchment. The archivist turned page after page, each one revealing new wonders and new terrors. He read of a wall of ice that would fall despite having stood for 8,000 years, of dead men walking under the light of blue flames, of a winter that would last for decades and threaten to become eternal. But woven through all these visions of darkness and despair were threads of hope, moments when the choices of individual men and women would prove capable of altering the course of destiny itself. It was then, as he absorbed prophecy after prophecy, each one more incredible than the last, that the archivist made his decision. He could not leave this knowledge buried in the depths beneath the citadel, hidden away like a shameful secret. The world had a right to know the truth about the Mad King, about the visions that had driven him to acts that seemed like madness, but were actually desperate attempts to prepare for disasters yet to come. More than that, if the prophecies were true, if the darkness that Eris had seen was indeed approaching, then someone needed to gather all the scattered pieces of his visions and make them available to those who would be called upon to face what was coming. He began that very night, carefully copying passages from the journal onto parchment he had brought with him. Each word had to be transcribed exactly, every detail preserved with perfect fidelity, for he had learned from Pycelle and Varys that even the smallest variations could alter the meaning of prophetic texts in ways that might prove catastrophic. The work was slow and painstaking, requiring a steadiness of hand and clarity of mind that was difficult to maintain while surrounded by revelations that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of reality itself. As he worked, the archivist became aware of changes in the chamber around him. The air grew warmer, thick with the scent of burning wood and something else. Something that reminded him of the smell that lingered after lightning struck close enough to raise the hair on his arms. The lamp flame, which had burned with steady yellow light, began to flicker and dance, casting shadows that moved independently of any source the archivist could identify. But it was the journal itself that underwent the most dramatic transformation as his quill moved across the parchment. Copying word after word from Eris's prophecies, the original text began to glow with soft silver light, as though the act of transcription was awakening powers that had lain dormant within the blood-red ink. The glow was gentle at first, barely noticeable unless he looked directly at the pages, but it grew stronger with each word he copied, until the entire journal seemed to pulse with its own inner fire. The effect was mesmerizing. Beautiful in a way that spoke to something deep within his soul, some part of him that recognized the presence of magic even when his rational mind rejected such possibilities. But beauty was not the only quality the glowing text possessed. As the light grew brighter, the archivist began to see things that were not written on the pages, visions that seemed to rise from the ink itself like smoke from a fire that burned with no visible flame. He saw a girl with silver hair walking through flames that did not burn her, emerging from a funeral pyre with 3 dragon hatchlings clinging to her naked form. He saw a young man with dark hair and gray eyes standing atop a great wall of ice, staring out at an army of the dead that stretched to the horizon like a white sea under a starless sky. He saw a golden-haired woman standing at the window of a tower, watching a city burn beneath her while bells rang out a song of death and destruction. But perhaps most disturbing of all, he saw himself sitting in this very chamber, copying these very words while shadows moved around him like living things. In the vision, his face was older, marked by years of study and revelation, and his eyes held a depth of knowledge that seemed both blessing and curse. The future version of himself looked up from his work and met his gaze across the barriers of time, and when their eyes met, the older man smiled with profound sadness and mouthed words that made the present archivist's blood run cold. Some knowledge carries a price that must be paid in solitude and silence. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving the archivist staring at pages that once again showed nothing but Eris's handwritten prophecies. But the warning remained, burning in his memory like a brand pressed into his consciousness. He was embarking on a journey that would transform him in ways he could not yet imagine. A quest for truth that would require him to sacrifice not just his comfort and safety, but perhaps his very sanity. Yet he could not stop. The knowledge he had gained, the truths he had witnessed, created an obligation that transcended personal considerations. If Eris's prophecies were accurate, if the threats they described were real and approaching, then someone needed to piece together the complete picture of what was coming and how it might be faced. The Mad King had been silenced by those who feared the implications of his visions, but perhaps it was not too late for his warnings to serve their intended purpose. The archivist worked through the night and into the early hours of dawn, copying passage after passage from the journal, while the chamber around him continued to pulse with otherworldly energy. He transcribed prophecies of wars fought with weapons of light and shadow, of kingdoms that would rise from the ashes of those that had fallen, of sacrifices that would be required from those who valued love more than power. Each prophecy was a piece of a vast puzzle, and as more pieces fell into place, the outline of something immense and terrible began to emerge. The long night was coming again, just as it had come 8,000 years before. But this time there would be no guarantee that the dawn would follow. The forces of darkness were stronger now, more cunning, armed with knowledge gained from their previous defeat, and determined not to make the same mistakes again. Against them would stand a handful of heroes, most of whom would die before they fully understood the role they were meant to play in the great battle between ice and fire. But there was hope, fragile and uncertain, hidden within the prophecies, like seeds waiting for the proper conditions to sprout. The Mad King had seen paths to victory as well as defeat, futures where the light triumphed over darkness through the courage and sacrifice of those who chose duty over personal desire. These paths were narrow and treacherous, requiring precise actions at exact moments, but they existed, shining like distant stars in the vast night of possibility. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the ancient stones above, the archivist realized that his quest was only beginning. The journal he had discovered was not the only repository of Arius visions, merely the first and most accessible. There were other caches of prophetic writings scattered throughout the 7 kingdoms, hidden by those who had served the Mad King in his final years and understood the true nature of what he had seen. Finding them would require him to travel far from the safety of the citadel, to seek out sources that preferred to remain hidden, to ask questions that might attract the attention of those who had spent decades ensuring that certain truths remained buried. But he would find them, these scattered fragments of prophetic truth, and he would piece them together into a complete picture of what was coming and how it might be faced. The Mad King's voice had been silenced by sword and fire, but his visions would live on, preserved and protected by those who understood that some knowledge was too important to remain hidden, regardless of the personal cost of bringing it to light. The Game of Thrones was about to begin its final phase, though few of the players yet understood the true nature of the stakes for which they played. The archivist would make certain that at least some of them learned the truth in time to make the choices that would determine whether dawn would ever come again. The journey from Old Town to King's Landing took the archivist through landscapes that seemed to echo with the weight of prophecy itself. Every village he passed, every crossroads where he paused to water his horse, every inn where he sought shelter from the autumn rains, all of them featured in some fragment of Arius's visions. The Mad King had not merely seen the great sweep of history, but had witnessed the smallest details, the individual moments of joy and sorrow that would shape the lives of common folk caught in the web of destiny. In the journal fragments he carried, carefully wrapped in oiled leather and hidden within the false bottom of his travel chest, Teres had written of a baker's daughter in Bitterbridge who would lose her father to the War of the 5 Kings, but would find love with a wounded soldier who bore the Wolf of Stark on his surcoat. He had described the exact shade of blue in the eyes of a fisherman's son from the Trident, who would grow up to become a Septon and comfort thousands in their final moments. These were not the grand pronouncements of fate that bards sing about in their songs, but the intimate human details that revealed the true scope of prophetic sight. The Red Keep, when it finally rose before him like a crimson crown atop Aegon's hill, bore little resemblance to the fortress he had expected. Where the histories spoke of a seat of power built to inspire awe and command respect, the archivist saw instead a structure haunted by the weight of secrets too terrible to speak aloud. The towers seemed to lean inward as though whispering to each other, sharing knowledge that no mortal ear should hear. The walls themselves appeared to pulse with a life of their own, as though the very stones remembered the blood that had been spilled within their embrace. His credentials as a representative of the citadel granted him access to the royal archives, though he could sense the suspicion in the eyes of the guards who escorted him through corridors that seemed to stretch much farther than their physical dimensions should have allowed. The castle was a maze of hidden passages and secret chambers, built not just to house the royal family, but to conceal the countless mysteries that had accumulated during 3 centuries of Targaryen rule. The official archives were exactly what he had expected. Carefully organized records that told the approved version of events with meticulous detail and complete fabrication. Here were the documents that painted Aerys as a king whose mind had been twisted by isolation and inbreeding, whose final years had been marked by increasing paranoia and violent outbursts. The scribes who had compiled these records had done their work with masterful skill, creating a narrative so convincing that even those who had lived through the events it described might find themselves questioning their own memories. But the archivist had not come to King's Landing to read comfortable lies. He had come seeking the truth that lay hidden beneath layers of official deception, and he knew that such truth would not be found in any archive that welcomed visitors with open doors and helpful guides. The real secrets of the Red Keep lay elsewhere, in the forgotten corners and abandoned chambers that had been sealed away when the new dynasty took power. It was in one such chamber, a room that had once served as Aerys's private study, that the archivist made his first major discovery. The chamber had been locked and barred for nearly 2 decades, its contents left untouched since the day that Robert Baratheon had claimed the Iron Throne. Officially, it contained nothing of importance, merely the personal effects of a dead king whose madness had brought ruin to his dynasty. But the archivist had learned to distrust official explanations, and his patient examination of the chamber's defenses revealed modifications that suggested its contents were far more significant than anyone admitted. The lock that secured the chamber door was not the simple mechanism that appearances suggested, but a complex puzzle that required knowledge of Valyrian glyphs to solve. The bars that reinforced the door were made not of common iron but of dragonglass, the volcanic stone that the ancient Valyrians had used in their most sacred rituals. Most telling of all, the air around the chamber door carried the same subtle scent of burning and lightning that had marked the hidden vault beneath the citadel. When the lock finally yielded to his patient manipulation, when the door swung open to reveal the chamber beyond, the archivist found himself standing in a room that defied every assumption he had formed about the Mad King's character and capabilities. Where he had expected chaos and neglect, he found instead a space arranged with the precision of a master scholar's workshop. Books lined the walls in careful order, their spines marked with symbols that identified them as works on prophecy, ancient history, and the mystical arts. Tables arranged throughout the room held instruments of brass and silver, devices whose purpose he could only guess at, but which clearly served some function in the interpretation of visions and dreams. But it was the walls themselves that stole his breath, and nearly cost him his composure. Every surface not occupied by books or shelves was covered with writing, layer upon layer of text that had been added over the course of years. The handwriting was Aerys's, but it showed a progression from the careful script of his youth to the increasingly erratic scrawl of his final years. Yet even in its most chaotic form, the writing displayed an internal logic that spoke of a mind pushed to its limits, but never truly broken. The earliest writings, those closest to the floor, and clearly the first to be added, dealt with the history of House Targaryen and the nature of dragon dreams. Aerys had traced his family's gift for prophecy back to the days before the doom of Valyria, connecting his own visions to those of his ancestors who had foreseen the destruction of their homeland and led their people to safety across the narrow sea. The dragon dreams were not random glimpses of possible futures, but part of a great tapestry of sight that stretched across centuries, each dreamer adding their own thread to a pattern that would not be complete until the very end of days. Higher on the walls, added as Aerys's understanding of his gift deepened, were detailed analyses of specific prophecies and their fulfillment. The archivist read accounts of visions that had seemed like meaningless nightmare, but had later proven to be precise warnings of events yet to come. A dream of wolves feasting on a great stag had preceded the death of Robert Baratheon by more than a decade. A vision of golden lions drowning in their own blood had foretold the destruction of House Lannister with accuracy that was both beautiful and terrible. But it was the highest writings, those that Aerys had added in his final years when his gift had reached its greatest and most terrible clarity, that revealed the true scope of what he had seen. These were not mere prophecies, but detailed tactical analyses of the coming war between the living and the dead. Aerys had mapped out the movements of the army of the dead with the precision of a master strategist, identifying their strengths and weaknesses, their preferred methods of attack, the environmental conditions that would favor their advance. Most remarkably, he had identified the specific individuals who would be crucial to the defense of the realm, describing their appearances, their capabilities, and the roles they would play in the great battle to come. The Bastard of Winterfell featured prominently in these later writings, described not as a minor player in the Game of Thrones, but as the key around which all other plans would revolve. Aerys had seen Jon Snow's true parentage, his destiny as a leader of men, his ultimate sacrifice for the salvation of the living world. The archivist spent hours copying these war writings, his hand cramping from the constant work, but his mind blazing with the implications of what he was recording. This was not the study of a madman, but the workshop of a prophet who had dedicated his life to understanding and preparing for the greatest threat the world had ever faced. Every detail had been carefully considered, every possibility explored, every potential solution examined with the thoroughness of a scholar whose work would determine the fate of millions. As he worked, the chamber around him began to exhibit the same strange properties he had observed in the vault beneath the citadel. The air grew thick with the scent of prophecy, and the writings on the walls began to glow with soft silver light. But here the effect was stronger, more focused, as though the accumulated weight of years spent in prophetic contemplation had saturated the very stones with otherworldly energy. It was then that the archivist discovered the chamber's greatest secret, hidden behind a tapestry that depicted the conquest of Westeros by Aegon the Dragon. The tapestry itself was a work of art, woven with threads of gold and silver that caught the light in ways that made the depicted scenes seem to move and breathe. But when he pushed it aside, searching for more of Aerys's writings, he found instead an alcove that contained a single object of such beauty and power that it took his breath away. The object was a sphere of what appeared to be crystal, though it possessed a depth and clarity that no earthly stone could match. It was approximately the size of a man's head, perfectly round and filled with swirling patterns of light that moved like living things within its crystalline depths. The surface was warm to the touch, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the beating of his own heart, and when he lifted it from its resting place, the entire chamber was filled with a sound like distant singing, voices raised in harmonies that spoke of joy and sorrow intertwined. This was a seeing stone, one of the Palantiri that the Valyrians had crafted in the days before the Doom. The archivist had read of such devices in the most ancient texts, artifacts that allowed their users to see across vast distances and even across the barriers of time itself. Most had been lost in the destruction of Valyria, but a few had survived, brought to Westeros by the Targaryens and passed down through the generations as treasures beyond price. As he held the stone, images began to form within its depths, visions that made him gasp with wonder and terror. He saw the Night King in his stronghold beyond the wall, a figure of such malevolent power that even glimpsing him through the seeing stone made the archivist's soul recoil in horror. He saw the Dragon Queen in the east, her children growing strong and fierce as they prepared for the flight across the narrow sea. He saw the Bastard of Winterfell, still a boy but already bearing the weight of destiny on his young shoulders. But most clearly of all, he saw Aerys himself, not as the broken king that history remembered, but as he had truly been in his final years. The Mad King stood in this very chamber, his hands pressed against the seeing stone, his eyes wide with the pain of visions too terrible to bear. Tears streamed down his face as he witnessed the suffering that was coming, the countless deaths that would be required before the darkness could be turned back. And in that moment, the archivist understood the true tragedy of Aerys Targaryen. He had not been mad, but had been driven to the edge of madness by the burden of perfect knowledge. He had seen the future with absolute clarity, had witnessed every death, every loss, every moment of pain that would be required to save the world from eternal night. And he had been powerless to prevent any of it, able only to watch as events unfolded exactly as he had foreseen, his warnings dismissed as the ravings of a diseased mind. The vision faded, leaving the archivist alone in the chamber with the weight of revelation heavy on his shoulders. He now possessed not just the written records of Aerys's prophecies, but the very tool that had allowed the Mad King to see across the barriers of time. With the Seeing Stone, he could witness the events that were coming, could perhaps even find some way to alter them, to change the future that seemed as fixed as the movement of the stars. But as he wrapped the stone in the same oiled leather that protected his other treasures, as he prepared to leave the chamber and continue his search for the scattered fragments of Aerys's wisdom, the archivist could not escape the feeling that he was being watched. Not by guards or servants, but by forces that existed beyond the physical world, entities that had taken notice of his quest and were even now deciding whether to help or hinder his efforts. The Game of Thrones was not merely a contest between mortal players, but a reflection of larger conflicts that stretched across dimensions and ages. The Mad King had been both player and pawn in this greater game, and now the archivist was taking his place at the board, ready to make the moves that would determine whether the dawn would ever come again. The discovery of Aerys's private study and the Seeing Stone within it seemed to provide a complete explanation for the mystery that had consumed the archivist's thoughts for so many years. The Mad King had not been insane, but had instead been blessed, or perhaps cursed, with the ability to see across the boundaries of time, using one of the most powerful artifacts ever crafted by the sorcerer lords of old Valyria. His apparent madness had been nothing more than the natural reaction of a mortal mind forced to witness the full scope of future suffering without the power to prevent it. For several days after leaving the Red Keep, as he rode south toward the Stormlands in search of other caches of prophetic writings, the archivist felt a sense of satisfaction that bordered on elation. He had solved the puzzle that had eluded scholars for decades, had uncovered the truth behind one of the most misunderstood figures in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. The Seeing Stone, carefully wrapped and hidden in his saddlebags, pulsed with warmth that seemed to confirm his conclusions, its crystalline depths showing him glimpses of the future that validated everything he had learned about Aerys's gift. Yet as the leagues passed beneath his horse's hooves, as the familiar landscape of the Crownlands gave way to the wilder terrain of the Stormlands, a peculiar unease began to settle over him like morning mist rising from a still pond. The explanation he had constructed, elegant and complete though it seemed, left certain questions unanswered, certain details that refused to fit into the pattern he had assembled from his discoveries. The first of these troubling inconsistencies concerned the timing of Aerys's prophetic visions. According to the writings on the walls of his study, the Mad King had begun experiencing dragon dreams in his youth, long before he had access to the Seeing Stone. The Palantir had been a Targaryen treasure, true, but it had been kept in the vaults beneath Dragonstone, not in the royal apartments of the Red Keep. Aerys would not have gained access to it until after his coronation, yet the earliest dated prophecies in his collection predated his ascension to the throne by several years. More puzzling still was the nature of the visions themselves. The Seeing Stones of Valyria were powerful artifacts, capable of showing their users events occurring in distant places, or even glimpses of possible futures. But they were tools requiring conscious effort and specific techniques to operate effectively. The prophecies attributed to Aerys, however, seemed to come to him unbidden, arriving in dreams and waking visions that he could not control or direct. The seeing stone might have helped him interpret these visions, might have allowed him to see them with greater clarity, but it could not have been their source. The archivist's unease deepened when he stopped for the night at a small inn near Bronzegate, an establishment that catered primarily to travelers making their way between King's Landing and Storm's End. The innkeeper, a weathered man whose family had served guests on this road for generations, greeted him with the practiced hospitality of one who had learned to read the quality of a patron's purse with a single glance. But when the conversation turned to the history of the region, when the archivist mentioned his interest in the reign of the Mad King, the innkeeper's demeanor changed in ways that spoke of memories too dark to share with casual strangers. "You're not the first scholar to come asking questions about those days," the innkeeper said, his voice dropping to a whisper that barely carried across the common room. There was another, maybe 5 years past, a maester from Old Town, who claimed to be writing a history of the Targaryen kings. He stayed here for 3 nights, asking questions about the old days, about things that happened before and during Robert's rebellion. The archivist leaned forward, his interest sharpened by the possibility that another scholar had walked this path before him. What sort of questions did he ask? What did he want to know? The innkeeper glanced around the room, ensuring that no other patrons were close enough to overhear their conversation. He wanted to know about the dreams, about the visions that the common folk had in the years before the war. Strange dreams, he called them. Dreams that came to people who had never had the gift of prophecy. Dreams that seemed to spread from village to village like a plague. A chill ran down the archivist's spine, though he could not immediately identify the source of his discomfort. What kind of dreams were these? What did people see? Fire and blood. Mostly, the innkeeper replied, his voice heavy with the weight of old memories. Dreams of dragons flying over burning cities, of ice spreading south from the wall, of dead men walking under a starless sky. But the strangest part was how similar they all were, as though everyone who had them was seeing the same visions, experiencing the same nightmares. The archivist felt his carefully constructed explanation beginning to crumble like a castle built on sand. If common folk throughout the realm had been experiencing prophetic dreams during Eris's reign, if the visions had been spreading from person to person like ripples in a pond, then the seeing stone could not have been their source. The Palantir was a tool for individual use, not a device capable of broadcasting visions to thousands of people across vast distances. Did this other maester, this historian from Old Town, did he reach any conclusions about these dreams? The archivist asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The innkeeper's expression grew even more troubled, and he glanced toward the stairs that led to the upper floors of the inn. He left in the middle of the night, 3 days after he arrived, didn't settle his bill, didn't take his belongings, just vanished like morning mist. We found his room empty except for a single piece of parchment on the writing desk. On it he had written the same words over and over again, hundreds of times, until the ink covered the entire page. "What words?" the archivist whispered, though some part of him already knew what the innkeeper would say. "The prince that was promised will be born of ice and fire, and his song will wake the dead from their eternal sleep." The innkeeper shook his head, his face pale in the candlelight. "We burned that parchment, didn't want anything to do with such dark talk. But I can still see those words, written in a hand that grew shakier with each repetition, as though the man who wrote them was losing his mind even as he worked." The archivist excused himself and retired to his room, but sleep would not come despite his exhaustion. He lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while his mind raced through the implications of what he had learned. The prophetic visions that had plagued Ares's reign had not been limited to the king himself, but had spread throughout the realm like a contagion of supernatural sight. Common folk with no gift for prophecy had found themselves experiencing dreams that showed them the same futures that tormented their king. And at least one other scholar who had investigated these phenomena had vanished under circumstances that suggested he had discovered something too terrible to bear. The Seeing Stone, which had seemed to provide such a complete explanation for Eris's abilities, now appeared to be merely one piece of a much larger puzzle. The Mad King had not been the source of the prophetic visions, but had instead been their focal point, the individual through whom some greater force had chosen to reveal its knowledge of things to come. The stone had allowed him to see these visions more clearly, had helped him understand their meaning and significance, but it had not created them. But if the Seeing Stone was not the source of the visions, then what was? What force possessed the power to grant prophetic sight to thousands of people simultaneously, to flood the realm with dreams of fire and ice, of dragons and dead men walking? The archivist knew of no artifact or magical practice capable of such widespread influence, no power in the known world that could affect so many minds across such vast distances. Unless, of course, the source was not something from the known world at all. The thought that came to him then was so disturbing that he sat up in bed, his heart racing with sudden fear. What if the prophetic visions had not been sent by any human agency, but had instead been the work of the very forces they described? What if the approaching darkness, the army of the dead that featured so prominently in Eris's prophecies, possessed the power to influence the minds of the living across the barriers of time itself? The idea was almost too terrible to contemplate, yet it explains so much that had previously seemed inexplicable. The widespread nature of the visions, their consistent content, the way they had seemed to intensify as Robert's rebellion approached, and the magical protections that had guarded the realm for centuries began to weaken. If the enemy beyond the wall possessed the ability to reach across time and space, to plant visions in the minds of those who might oppose them, then everything the archivist thought he knew about the nature of the conflict was wrong. The Night King was not merely a physical threat, an army of the dead that could be faced with sword and fire. He was a force of corruption that could influence events decades or even centuries before his physical arrival, sowing discord and madness in the minds of those who might otherwise have prepared effective defenses. The Mad King's apparent insanity, the collapse of his dynasty, the civil wars that had weakened the realm, all of it might have been orchestrated by an enemy whose power transcended the normal boundaries of cause and effect. The archivist rose from his bed and retrieved the Seeing Stone from his saddlebags, unwrapping it with hands that trembled despite his efforts to remain calm. If his new theory was correct, if the visions had been sent by the enemy rather than received through natural prophetic gift, then the stone might show him something that would confirm or deny his suspicions. As he held the crystal sphere and focused his thoughts upon it, images began to form in its depths, visions that made his blood run cold. He saw the Night King as he had appeared in previous glimpses, but now he could see beyond the figure's icy exterior to the malevolent intelligence that lurked within. This was not merely a creature of ice and death, but a being of immense cunning and patience, one who had spent thousands of years planning his return to the world of the living. The visions showed him the Night King's true strategy, a campaign of corruption and manipulation that had begun long before the first dead man had risen to walk again. The enemy had reached across the barriers of time to plant visions in the minds of those who might threaten his plans, driving them to madness and despair, turning their own gifts against them. Ares had been one of many targets, chosen because his Targaryen blood made him particularly susceptible to prophetic visions, but he had not been the only one. The archivist saw other figures, other potential heroes who had been driven to madness or death by visions too terrible to bear. He saw maesters who had burned their own books rather than risk spreading the knowledge they contained. Septons who had abandoned their faith after witnessing the futility of prayer against such overwhelming darkness. Lords who had turned to drink or other vices to drown out the nightmares that plagued their sleep. The enemy's strategy was diabolically elegant in its simplicity. By showing potential opponents exactly what they would face, by revealing the full scope of the coming darkness, the Night King had paralyzed them with despair. Those who might have prepared defenses instead fell into madness or despair, their warnings dismissed as the ravings of diseased minds. The realm's greatest strength, its heroes and prophets and wise men, had been turned into its greatest weakness. As the visions faded, and the seeing stone returned to its normal crystalline clarity, the archivist understood that his quest had become far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He was not merely seeking to uncover the truth about a dead king's madness, but was instead walking in the footsteps of those who had been deliberately driven to destruction by an enemy of unimaginable power and cunning. The Night King knew of his investigation, had perhaps even guided his steps toward the discoveries he had made. The enemy was using him, allowing him to gather the scattered pieces of prophetic knowledge for reasons that remained hidden but were certainly not benevolent. Every revelation he uncovered, every truth he assembled, might be serving the very darkness he sought to understand and oppose. Yet he could not stop, could not abandon his quest, despite the terrible knowledge of what lay behind it. The visions were real, the threat was approaching, and someone needed to understand the full scope of what was coming. If the Night King was manipulating him, if his discoveries were serving some dark purpose, then perhaps the key to victory lay in understanding that manipulation and finding a way to turn it against its author. The Game of Thrones had revealed another layer of complexity, another level of strategy that operated beyond the comprehension of mortal players. The archivist was no longer just a seeker of truth, but a piece on a board whose dimensions stretched across time itself, moved by forces that existed in the spaces between life and death, light and darkness, hope and despair. The road from the Stormlands to Dragonstone wound through countryside that seemed to grow more desolate with each passing mile, as though the very land remembered the weight of prophecies that had once echoed across these hills and valleys. The archivist rode in silence, his mind still reeling from the revelations that had shattered his comfortable explanations and replaced them with questions far more disturbing than any he had previously dared to ask. The Seeing Stone, wrapped in its protective coverings and secured within his saddlebags, pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of his increasingly troubled heart. Dragonstone rose from the waters of Blackwater Bay, like a monument to powers that mortals were never meant to comprehend, its twisted spires and grotesque gargoyles carved from the living rock by Valyrian sorcerers whose names had been lost to time and flame. The castle had been the seat of House Targaryen for 3 centuries, but its roots stretched back much further, back to the days when the Freehold had ruled half the known world, and dragons had been as common as horses in the streets of great cities that now existed only as glass and ash. The current Lord of Dragonstone was Stannis Baratheon, Robert's younger brother, a man whose rigid sense of duty and justice had made him many enemies, but few friends. The archivist had met Stannis once before, during his early years at the Citadel, and had found him to be a man who valued truth above comfort, a quality that might serve his current quest well. More importantly, Stannis had been present at the siege of Storm's End during Robert's rebellion, had witnessed firsthand the strange events that had marked the final years of Aerys's reign. The castle's main hall was a testament to the alien artistry of old Valyria, its walls decorated with dragon motifs that seemed to move and shift in the flickering torchlight. Stannis received him in a chamber lined with maps and charts, documents that spoke of his meticulous nature and his ongoing efforts to understand the political currents that flowed through the 7 kingdoms like hidden rivers beneath the surface of apparent stability. "You come seeking knowledge of the Mad King," Stannis said without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to cutting through pleasantries to reach the heart of matters. Few scholars venture to Dragonstone for such purposes, not when the accepted histories provide such comfortable explanations for uncomfortable truths. What makes you different from the others who have walked this path before you? The archivist chose his words carefully, knowing that Stannis Baratheon was not a man who tolerated deception or evasion. "I have reason to believe that the accepted histories are incomplete, my lord. That Aerys Targaryen was not the simple madman that most accounts describe, but something far more complex and far more dangerous. I have found evidence that suggests his apparent insanity was actually a form of prophetic sight, visions of the future that drove him to actions that seemed irrational but were actually desperate attempts to prepare for threats that others could not see. Stannis regarded him with eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to examine the intentions that lay beneath. And what evidence have you found that supports such a radical reinterpretation of events? What proof do you possess that would justify overturning decades of accepted scholarship? In response, the archivist produced one of the documents he had copied from Aerys's private study, a prophecy that described Robert's death with accuracy that was impossible to explain through conventional means. Stannis read the text with growing amazement, his expression shifting from skepticism to wonder to something approaching fear as the implications of what he was seeing became clear. "This was written during Aerys's lifetime?" Stannis asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Before Robert's rebellion, before my brother had even considered claiming the throne." "More than a decade before his death," the archivist confirmed. "And it is not the only such prophecy in the collection. Aerys saw the War of the Five Kings, the rise of your brother Renly, your own campaign for the Iron Throne, all of it described with perfect accuracy years before any of the participants had been born." Stannis set the document aside and moved to the window that overlooked the narrow sea, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at waters that had once carried the black ships of Valyria to conquest and glory. "I was there, during the final siege of Storm's End. I saw things that I have never spoken of to any man, events that made no sense at the time, but which your discoveries might finally explain." The Lord of Dragonstone turned back to face his guest, his expression grave with the weight of memories too strange to share with those who had not witnessed them firsthand. In the months before King's Landing fell, before Jaime Lannister drove his sword through Aerys's back, strange things began to happen throughout the realm. Not just the visions and dreams that you have documented, but physical manifestations, signs and portents that spoke of powers stirring that had long lain dormant. Stannis moved to a chest that sat in the corner of the chamber and withdrew from it, an object wrapped in black silk. When he unwrapped it, the archivist gasped at what was revealed. It was a piece of dragon glass, volcanic stone from the fires of Dragonstone itself, but it had been shaped and polished into the form of a dagger whose blade seemed to drink in the light around it. This was found in the Sept of Remembrance in King's Landing, on the altar where Aerys used to pray in his final months, Stannis explained. The Septons claimed it had simply appeared there one morning, manifesting from nothing like a gift from the gods themselves, but those who touched it reported visions, glimpses of futures too terrible to describe. The High Septon ordered it removed and sent to Dragonstone, where it has remained ever since. The archivist reached out to touch the blade, and the moment his fingers made contact with the cool stone, his mind was flooded with images that made his previous visions seem like gentle dreams. He saw the army of the dead in all its terrible glory, rank upon rank of corpses animated by magics that made a mockery of the natural order. He saw the Night King himself, not as a distant figure of legend, but as a being of such malevolent intelligence that his very presence seemed to corrupt the air around him. But most disturbing of all, he saw the true scope of the enemy's strategy. The Night King had not simply been waiting beyond the wall for his moment to strike, but had been actively working to weaken the realm's defenses for centuries. The fall of the Targaryens, the civil wars that had followed Robert's rebellion, the political chaos that had consumed the Seven Kingdoms. All of it had been orchestrated by an intelligence that thought in terms of millennia rather than years. The visions showed him other artifacts like the dragonglass dagger, objects that had appeared throughout the realm during Aerys's reign as physical anchors for the supernatural forces that were gathering strength. Some had been found in ancient tombs that had been sealed for thousands of years. Others had manifested in sacred groves where the old gods were still worshipped. Still others had been discovered in the ruins of castles that had been abandoned since the Age of Heroes. Each artifact was a piece of a vast puzzle, a component in a magical working that spanned the entire continent. The Night King was not merely gathering an army of the dead, but was preparing to fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself, to transform the world of the living into a realm where death held dominion over all things. The artifacts were focal points for this transformation, anchors that would allow the enemy's power to take permanent hold in the physical world. When the visions finally faded, when the archivist found himself once again standing in Stannis's chamber with the dragon glass dagger cool and quiet in his hands, he understood that his quest had entered an entirely new phase. It was no longer enough to simply gather the scattered fragments of Aerys's prophecies and attempt to understand their meaning. The enemy was actively working to bring about the future that the Mad King had seen, using the very artifacts and knowledge that Aerys had left behind as tools in their campaign of corruption and transformation. "You see it now," Stannis said, his voice heavy with the weight of knowledge that had burdened him for decades. "The true scope of what we face, the enemy that moves in shadows and works through whispers and dreams. Aerys saw it all, understood what was coming, but his warnings were dismissed as the ravings of a madman. Those of us who witnessed the signs, who saw the artifacts appear and felt their power, we chose to keep silent rather than risk being branded as mad ourselves." The archivist rewrapped the dagger and handed it back to Stannis, his mind already racing ahead to the implications of what he had learned. How many others know of these artifacts? How many have been found and hidden away by those who feared their power? "More than you might expect, fewer than we need," Stannis replied cryptically. "There are others who have walked this path before you, scholars and septons, and even some lords who have pieced together fragments of the truth. Most have chosen to keep their knowledge secret, to guard these artifacts, and hope that the threat they represent never manifests. But a few, a precious few, have dedicated their lives to understanding the enemy's strategy and finding ways to counter it." Stannis moved to his desk and withdrew a map that showed the entire continent of Westeros, marked with symbols and notations in his own careful hand. "These are the locations where artifacts have been found, where the signs of the enemy's influence have been strongest. As you can see, they form a pattern, a network of power that spans from the Wall to Dawn, from the Iron Islands to the Fingers." The archivist studied the map with growing amazement and horror. The marked locations did indeed form a pattern, a geometric design that spoke of careful planning and supernatural understanding of the forces that shaped the physical world. The network of artifacts created a web of influence that touched every major population center in the Seven Kingdoms, every castle and city and town where the enemy's corruption might take hold. "But there is hope," Stannis continued, his voice carrying a note of grim determination that reminded the archivist why this man had held Storm's End against impossible odds. "The enemy's strategy depends on secrecy, on operating in shadows, while their opponents remain ignorant of the true nature of the threat. But knowledge is power, and if we can gather enough of the truth, if we can understand the full scope of their plans, then perhaps we can find a way to turn their own weapons against them." The Lord of Dragonstone moved to another chest and withdrew from it a collection of documents that bore the seals of houses throughout the Seven Kingdoms. "These are reports from the other Guardians, men and women who have dedicated their lives to watching for signs of the enemy's influence. They represent a network of knowledge that stretches across the continent, a secret society of those who understand what is at stake and are willing to risk everything to prevent the darkness from taking hold." The archivist felt a surge of hope that was the first positive emotion he had experienced since beginning to understand the true scope of the enemy's strategy. He was not alone in his quest for truth, not the only one who had seen through the comfortable lies that most people use to explain away the inexplicable. There were others who shared his burden of knowledge, others who understood that the Game of Thrones was merely the surface layer of a conflict that involved forces beyond mortal comprehension. "Will you introduce me to these Guardians?" the archivist asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Will you share with me the knowledge they have gathered, the artifacts they have protected? Stannis smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun, an expression that transformed his stern features and revealed glimpses of the man he might have been in a world where such terrible knowledge was not necessary. That, my friend, is exactly what I was hoping you would ask. The network has been waiting for someone like you, someone with the skills and dedication necessary to piece together the complete picture of what we face. Your quest is about to become far more dangerous, but also far more important than you ever imagined. As night fell over Dragonstone, as the ancient castle settled into the comfortable rhythms of evening routine, the archivist found himself standing at the threshold of discoveries that would dwarf everything he had learned so far. The Mad King's prophecies were just the beginning, the first thread in a tapestry of knowledge that stretched across centuries and touched every corner of the known world. The enemy beyond the wall was real and active, and possessed of intelligence and power that made mortal concerns seem trivial by comparison. But there were those who stood ready to face that enemy, guardians who had spent their lives preparing for the final battle between light and darkness. The archivist was about to join their ranks, to become part of a struggle that would determine not just the fate of the Seven Kingdoms, but the future of all living things. The Game of Thrones was ending, and the real war was about to begin. The secret chamber beneath Dragonstone's great hall had been carved from the living rock by Valyrian stonemasons, whose techniques had died with the doom, their knowledge buried beneath the molten glass that had once been the greatest city in the world. The walls bore the same twisted dragon motifs that decorated the castle above, but here they seemed to writhe and move in the torchlight, as though the stone itself retained some memory of the fires that had shaped it. The air was thick with the scent of ancient magic, a mixture of sulfur and something sweeter, something that spoke of power beyond mortal understanding. 7 men and women sat around a table of black stone at the chamber's center, their faces illuminated by candles that burned with flames of different colors. Each candle had been crafted using techniques preserved from the old Valyrian traditions, their wax infused with substances that allowed them to burn with the pure light needed for the work they were about to undertake. The archivist recognized some of the faces from his years of travel and study, scholars and maesters whose reputations for wisdom were matched only by their discretion in matters that touched upon the supernatural. Stannis had introduced him to this council of guardians as simply the Seeker, a title that carried weight and significance among those who understood the true nature of the threats facing the realm. Each member of the council had walked a path similar to his own, had begun with simple scholarly curiosity and gradually uncovered truths that had transformed their understanding of the world and their place within it. They were united not by blood or oath, but by the shared burden of knowledge, too dangerous to speak aloud in the world above. The woman who sat at the head of the table was ancient beyond reckoning, her silver hair braided with threads of gold that caught the candlelight and made her seem to glow with inner fire. She had introduced herself as the Keeper of the Flame, a title that spoke to her role as the guardian of the most dangerous secrets the council had uncovered. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of one who had spent decades studying powers that could reshape the very foundations of reality. "The Seeker has brought us new pieces of the puzzle," she said, her eyes fixed upon the documents that the archivist had spread across the table. Prophecies that confirm what we have long suspected, evidence that the enemy's influence reached deeper into the heart of the realm than even we had dared to imagine. But with this knowledge comes a terrible realization, one that changes everything we thought we understood about the nature of our enemy and the scope of the threat we face. The man who sat to her right was younger, but bore the hollow look of one who had stared too long into abysses that stared back with malevolent intelligence. He had been introduced as the Chronicler of Shadows, a scholar who specialized in the study of the enemy's historical influence on the events of the past. His hands shook as he reached for one of the documents, a prophecy that described the long night's return with accuracy that was both beautiful and terrifying. We have been thinking of this conflict in terms that are too small, too limited by our mortal understanding of cause and effect, the chronicler said, his voice barely above a whisper. We assumed that the Night King was a threat that emerged from beyond the wall, an enemy that gathered strength in the frozen wastes and would eventually march south to claim the lands of the living. But the evidence that the Seeker has provided, combined with our own research, points to a conclusion that is far more disturbing. The Keeper gestured toward a map that covered most of one wall, a chart that showed not just the geography of Westeros, but the flow of magical energies that ran beneath the surface of the physical world like hidden rivers. Lines of power connected sacred sites and ancient strongholds, creating a network that pulsed with forces that had been laid down in the world's youth and had grown stronger with each passing age. The Night King is not an invader from beyond the wall, she explained, her words carrying the weight of revelation. He is a corruption that has always existed within the very foundations of this realm, a presence that has been influencing events from the shadows for thousands of years. The Long Night was not his first attempt at conquest, but merely his most obvious manifestation, the moment when his hidden influence finally emerged into the light. The archivist felt the familiar chill that accompanied the discovery of truths too large for comfortable comprehension. Everything he had learned, every assumption he had made about the nature of the enemy and the source of the threat, was being turned inside out and revealed to be fundamentally incomplete. The Night King was not a foreign invader, but a native corruption, not an enemy that could be defeated through conventional warfare, but a force that required understanding and confrontation on levels that transcended the physical world. A third member of the council, a woman whose skin bore the ritual scars of the priests of rule, leaned forward to add her own insights to the growing revelation. She had introduced herself as the speaker for the flame, one who interpreted the visions that came to those blessed with the gift of seeing in the fires of the Lord of Light. Her voice carried the musical cadence of one accustomed to speaking prophecy, but her words were grounded in scholarship rather than religious ecstasy. The enemy's strategy becomes clear when viewed from this perspective, she said, her scarred fingers tracing patterns on the table's surface that seemed to mirror the magical flows shown on the wall map. He has not been gathering strength for a single decisive campaign, but has been working to corrupt the very foundations of civilization itself. Every war, every plague, every moment of despair and darkness that has touched this realm has served his purposes, weakening the barriers between life and death, hope and despair, light and shadow. The chronicler of shadows nodded grimly and withdrew from his robes, a collection of documents that bore seals from every corner of the known world. We have been in communication with scholars and mystics from Essos, from the Summer Isles, from Sothorios and the lands beyond the Sunset Sea. The corruption that we face is not limited to Westeros, but extends across the entire world, manifesting in different forms but always serving the same ultimate purpose. The archivist studied the documents with growing horror, reading accounts of plagues that turned men into shambling corpses in the ruins of old Valyria, of shadows that walked the streets of Qarth and drained the life from all they touched, of ice that spread across the Dothraki Sea, despite the blazing heat of the eternal summer. Each report described phenomena that seemed unrelated on the surface, but which shared common elements that spoke of a single guiding intelligence behind them all. But how is this possible? The archivist asked, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to comprehend the scope of what was being revealed. How can a single entity, even one as powerful as the Night King, coordinate such vast and complex operations across the entire world? What force could possess such intelligence and reach? The Keeper of the Flame smiled sadly, an expression that spoke of knowledge purchased at a price too high for any mortal soul to pay. That, dear Seeker, is the question that has haunted us for decades. The answer lies in understanding the true nature of the enemy we face, the reality behind the myths and legends that have shaped our understanding of the world since the dawn of recorded history. She rose from her chair and moved to a cabinet that stood against the chamber's far wall, its surface carved with protective symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the colored candlelight. From within, she withdrew an object that made every person in the room gasp with wonder and terror. It was a sphere of the same black stone from which the table had been carved, but its surface was covered with glyphs that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could properly perceive. "This is a memory stone," the keeper explained, her voice heavy with the weight of the knowledge it contained. Crafted by the Valyrian Dragon Lords in the days before the Doom, it contains the preserved experiences and insights of those who first encountered the force we now call the Night King. What you are about to see will change your understanding of everything you thought you knew about the nature of good and evil, life and death, the very foundations of existence itself. The keeper placed her hands upon the stone, and immediately the chamber was filled with visions that made the archivist's previous glimpses of the future seem like pleasant dreams. He saw the world as it had been in the Age of Heroes, when the barriers between the physical and spiritual realms had been thin and magic had flowed through the world like water through a sieve. He saw the first encounters between the forces of life and the corruption that would become known as the Night King. Battles fought not with sword and fire, but with will and understanding and the fundamental power of creation itself. But most shocking of all, he saw the true origin of the enemy they faced. The Night King was not a creature that had been created by human magic gone wrong, not a weapon forged by the children of the forest that had escaped their control. He was something far older and far more fundamental, a principle of existence itself, the embodiment of entropy and ending and the inevitable decay that awaited all things. The Night King was death given intelligence and purpose, the final darkness that awaited every star and every world and every living thing that had ever drawn breath. He was not a being that could be killed or defeated in any conventional sense, but a force that could only be balanced, held in check by the equally fundamental forces of life and creation and hope. The vision showed him the true scope of the eternal conflict that raged beneath the surface of apparent reality. Throughout the cosmos, on countless worlds and in dimensions beyond number, the same battle was being fought between the forces of life and death, creation and destruction, hope and despair. The Night King was not unique to this world, but was instead one manifestation of a principle that existed wherever life had taken hold and dared to dream of permanence. But the visions also showed him something else, something that filled his heart with a hope so fragile and precious that he barely dared to acknowledge it. The forces of life were not passive victims in this cosmic struggle, but active participants, entities of equal power and fundamental importance who had shaped the very laws of reality to give life and hope and love the best possible chance of survival. The dragons were not mere beasts, but living embodiments of the creative force itself, vessels through which the power of life could manifest in the physical world. The Targaryens who had bonded with them were not simply dragon riders but champions of creation, individuals who had been chosen to serve as focal points for the eternal struggle between light and darkness. When the visions finally faded, when the memory stone returned to its passive state, and the chamber was once again illuminated only by the colored flames of the Valyrian candles, the archivist understood that his quest had fundamentally changed. He was no longer simply seeking to understand the prophecies of a dead king or to uncover the hidden history of a single realm. He had become part of a cosmic struggle that would determine the fate of all existence, a battle that was fought not just with armies and weapons, but with the fundamental forces that shaped reality itself. "Now you see," the keeper said softly, her ancient eyes reflecting depths of knowledge that spanned millennia. "Now you understand why the Mad King's prophecies were so important, why his visions drove him to actions that seemed like madness, but were actually desperate attempts to preserve hope in a world sliding toward eternal darkness." Aerys saw not just the immediate threat to his kingdom, but the ultimate threat to all creation, the moment when the balance between life and death would tip so far toward darkness that it might never be restored. The chronicler of shadows gathered the documents spread across the table, handling them with the reverence due to sacred texts. The prophecies speak of a final battle, a moment when the fate of all existence will be decided. The armies of the dead that march from beyond the wall are just the physical manifestation of a conflict that is being fought on levels that transcend the material world. The true battlefield is not any particular place, but the collective soul of all living things, the shared hope that allows life to continue in the face of inevitable entropy. The speaker for the flame extinguished her colored candle with a gesture that seemed to carry ritualistic significance. The enemy's greatest weapon is despair, the conviction that resistance is futile, that the darkness is inevitable, and all efforts to oppose it are meaningless. This is why Aris was driven to apparent madness, why so many who have glimpsed the truth have fallen into despair or taken their own lives. The knowledge of what we face is almost too terrible to bear, but bear it we must if there is to be any hope of victory. The archivist felt the weight of cosmic responsibility settling upon his shoulders like a cloak woven from the dreams of dying stars. He had sought answers to simple questions and had instead found himself at the center of a conflict that would determine whether light would continue to shine in a universe that was slowly being consumed by darkness. The Mad King's prophecies were not merely warnings about political upheaval or military threats, but desperate attempts to preserve hope in the face of ultimate despair. But with that responsibility came a clarity of purpose that he had never experienced before. The scattered fragments of knowledge he had been gathering were not random pieces of an ancient puzzle, but vital components of a strategy that might yet preserve life and hope and love in a cosmos that seemed determined to snuff them out. Every prophecy he uncovered, every artifact he studied, every truth he assembled might be the key that would tip the balance of the eternal struggle toward the light. The Council of Guardians had accepted him as one of their own, had shared with him secrets that could drive lesser minds to madness or despair, but they had also given him something even more precious, the knowledge that he was not alone in his struggle, that there were others who understood the true nature of what they faced, and were willing to sacrifice everything to preserve the possibility of victory. The Game of Thrones had revealed its deepest secret, the hidden reality that lay beneath all the surface conflicts and political maneuvering. The real war was not between houses or kingdoms, but between existence and oblivion, between the forces that created and nurtured life and those that sought to return all things to the cold silence that had existed before the first star kindled its fire in the darkness. The journey into the heart of the cosmic truth began not with grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but with the simple act of opening a book that had not been read in over 200 years. The tome rested upon a lectern of carved dragon bone in the deepest vault beneath Dragonstone, its pages bound in leather that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. The Keeper of the Flame had led the archivist to this final repository of knowledge with the measured steps of one who approached a sacred shrine, her ancient hands trembling slightly as she prepared to reveal secrets that had been guarded since the days when dragons still ruled the skies above Westeros. "This is the chronicle of the Eternal War," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the tomb like silence of the chamber. "Written by Aegon the Conqueror himself in the years before his death, when the weight of what he had seen and learned had finally overcome his ability to keep such knowledge locked within his heart. Every Targaryen king who followed him added their own insights to its pages, their own pieces of the vast puzzle that spans millennia and touches every corner of creation itself." The book's pages rustled with a sound like distant thunder as the Keeper opened it to reveal text written in the flowing script of High Valyrian, the words glowing softly with the same silver light that had marked Aerys's prophecies. But this was different, older, carrying within its carefully crafted sentences the accumulated wisdom of dragon lords who had walked between worlds and witnessed truths that mortal minds were never meant to comprehend. The first entry was dated to the year of Aegon's landing at what would become King's Landing, but the events it described had taken place much earlier, in the final days of Old Valyria, when the doom was already gathering like storm clouds on the horizon of possibility. Aegon wrote of visions that had come to him in the flames of Balerian's breath, dreams that showed him not just the destruction of his ancestral homeland, but the cosmic forces that had orchestrated that destruction as part of a pattern that stretched across the ages. The doom was not a natural disaster, Aegon had written, his words heavy with the burden of terrible knowledge. Nor was it the result of human folly or the price of delving too deeply into powers beyond mortal understanding. It was a deliberate act of cosmic warfare, a strike by the forces of entropy against the greatest bastion of creative power that had ever existed in the physical realm. The 40 families were not destroyed because they had grown too proud or too powerful, but because they had come too close to discovering the true nature of the eternal conflict that rages beneath the surface of apparent reality. The archivist read with growing amazement as Aegon described a network of connections that linked every major event in human history to the ongoing struggle between creation and destruction. The rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of heroes, the ebb and flow of magic throughout the world, all of it was part of a vast game played by forces that existed on levels of reality that transcended the physical universe. But it was the later entries, those added by Aegon's successors, that revealed the true scope of what the Targaryens had discovered. Each king had added their own insights to the growing body of knowledge, their own pieces of the puzzle that was slowly revealing itself across the generations. Magor the Cruel had written of the corrupted bloodlines that served the enemy's purposes, noble houses whose apparent loyalty masked deeper allegiances to forces that sought the extinction of all life. Jaehaerys the Wise had documented the hidden sanctuaries where the servants of creation gathered to coordinate their resistance to the spreading darkness. The most chilling entries were those written by the Mad Kings who had preceded Aerys, monarchs whose apparent insanity had actually been the result of glimpsing too much of the truth at once. King Balor the Blessed had seen visions of the final battle between light and darkness, witnessed the moment when the fate of all existence would hang in the balance and be decided by the choices of a handful of individuals who might not even understand the cosmic significance of their actions. The enemy's greatest strength lies in its patience. Beluror had written in script that grew increasingly erratic as the weight of revelation pressed down upon his mind. It thinks in terms of geological ages, plans campaigns that span millennia, shapes events with such subtlety that those who participate in them never realize they are serving purposes that extend far beyond their mortal comprehension. The corruption spreads not through conquest but through influence, turning the very foundations of civilization against itself. The archivist turned page after page, each one revealing new horrors and new wonders, new depths to the abyss that yawned beneath the comfortable assumptions of ordinary life. He read of bloodlines that had been carefully cultivated across thousands of years to produce individuals capable of channeling the fundamental forces of creation, of artifacts that had been placed at specific locations to serve as focal points for magical energies that could reshape the very laws of physics. But perhaps most disturbing were the entries that dealt with the enemy's infiltration of the very institutions that claimed to serve the light. The faith of the Seven, the Citadel, even some of the great houses that had ruled Westeros for centuries, all had been touched by the corruption that spread like a cancer through the heart of civilization itself. The enemy did not work through obvious servants or blatant displays of malevolent power, but through the slow, patient subversion of those who believed themselves to be serving good and righteous causes. The Keeper watched in silence, as the archivist absorbed revelation after revelation, her ancient eyes reflecting depths of sorrow that spoke of knowledge purchased at a price too high for any mortal soul to bear. When he finally looked up from the chronicle, his face pale with the weight of what he had learned, she nodded with the understanding of one who had walked this same path of discovery decades before. "Now you begin to see the true scope of what Ares faced," she said softly. He was not simply a king dealing with rebellious subjects or political challenges, but a guardian of cosmic forces trying to prepare for a battle that would determine the fate of all existence. Every decision he made, every action he took was influenced by knowledge of what was coming, and the terrible understanding that he might be the last Targaryen king with the power to influence the outcome. The chronicler of shadows emerged from the chamber's depths carrying a collection of documents that bore the dragon seal of House Targaryen. These were the most secret records of Aerys' reign, the true accounts of his final years that had been hidden away when Robert's rebellion swept away the dynasty that had guarded such dangerous knowledge for 3 centuries. The Mad King's apparent paranoia was actually perfect accuracy, the chronicler explained, as he spread the documents across the reading table. His accusations against his lords and advisors, his fears of poison and betrayal, his conviction that enemies surrounded him on all sides, all of it was based on knowledge that he had gained through years of studying the patterns of corruption and infiltration that the enemy used to achieve its goals. The documents revealed a conspiracy that dwarfed anything the archivist had previously imagined. Lord Tywin Lannister had not simply been an ambitious nobleman seeking to increase his family's power, but had been an unwitting servant of forces that sought to destroy the Targaryen dynasty and eliminate the last great bastion of resistance to the spreading darkness. The Faith Militant had not been a religious movement seeking to purify the realm, but a tool of corruption designed to undermine the magical protections that the Targaryens had maintained for centuries. Even Robert Baratheon, the hero of the rebellion that had overthrown the Mad King, had been manipulated by influences that he never recognized or understood. His love for Lyanna Stark had been genuine, but it had been shaped and directed by forces that recognized its potential to serve their cosmic purposes. The war that followed had not been a simple struggle between competing political factions, but a carefully orchestrated campaign to eliminate the last dynasty capable of coordinating effective resistance to the enemy's ultimate goals. But Aerys saw through it all. The speaker for the flame added, her voice carrying the musical cadence of prophecy fulfilled. He understood that the rebellion was not really about his alleged madness or political failures, but was instead the culmination of a strategy that had been developing for centuries. The enemy had finally succeeded in turning the realm against its protectors, had convinced the very people who should have been defending the light to destroy those who possessed the knowledge and power necessary to stand against the darkness. The archivist studied a map that showed the movement of armies during Robert's rebellion, but this version was marked with additional symbols that revealed the supernatural influences at work beneath the surface of apparent military strategy. Lines of magical force connected battlefields and strongholds, creating patterns that spoke of cosmic significance beyond the immediate political and military objectives that historians typically focused upon. The Battle of the Trident had not simply been a clash between rival claimants to the Iron Throne, but a ritual working of immense power, a ceremony of blood and death that had permanently altered the magical foundations of the realm. Rhaegar's death at Robert's hands had not just eliminated a potential king, but had severed one of the most important bloodline connections to the forces of creation, weakening the barriers that held the enemy at bay. The true tragedy of Aerys Targaryen, the Keeper said, as she closed the chronicle and returned it to its place of honor, was not that he went mad, but that he remained sane long enough to understand exactly what he was losing and why. He saw the entire cosmic struggle with perfect clarity, understood the roles that he and his family were meant to play in the eternal war between light and darkness, and was forced to watch helplessly as those very insights were used to justify his destruction. The chamber fell silent except for the soft whisper of air moving through passages carved from living rock, the barely audible sound of a fortress that had been built to last until the end of time. In that silence, the archivist could almost hear the echo of other voices, other conversations that had taken place in this sacred space over the centuries. How many Targaryen kings had stood where he now stood, learning truths that would reshape their understanding of their duties and their destiny? How many had left this chamber forever changed, carrying the burden of cosmic knowledge that would influence every decision they made for the rest of their lives? The revelation that burned in his mind like wildfire through dry grass was both terrible and magnificent in its implications. The Mad King had not been a villain whose death had saved the realm from tyranny, but had instead been a tragic hero whose destruction had removed the last effective guardian against forces that threatened all existence. Robert's rebellion had not been a glorious victory of justice over madness, but had instead been a catastrophic defeat that had left the realm defenseless against the approaching darkness. But buried within that terrible knowledge was a seed of hope so precious that the archivist barely dared to acknowledge it. The enemy's victory had not been complete, had not achieved all of its intended goals. The Targaryen bloodline survived in exile across the narrow sea, and with it the potential for restoration of the cosmic balance that had been disrupted by the dynasty's fall. The dragons were gone, true, but the capacity to birth them anew remained encoded in the very genes of those who carried the blood of old Valyria. More importantly, the network of guardians that had gathered around the Targaryens had survived the dynasty's fall, had continued to preserve the knowledge and artifacts necessary to continue the eternal struggle against entropy and despair. The enemy had achieved a great victory by destroying the most obvious center of resistance to its plans, but it had not succeeded in eliminating all opposition to its ultimate goals. The archivist understood now that his quest had been guided from the beginning by forces that operated on levels beyond his conscious awareness. His discovery of Aerys' hidden archives, his encounters with Pycelle and Varys, his introduction to the Council of Guardians, all of it had been orchestrated by intelligences that understood the cosmic significance of preserving and transmitting the knowledge that would be needed for the final battle between creation and destruction. He was not simply a scholar seeking to uncover historical truth, but was instead a vital component in a strategy that spanned millennia and touched every corner of existence itself. The enemy had won a great victory by eliminating the Targaryen dynasty, but the war was far from over, and the forces of light were already preparing for the next phase of the eternal struggle. The Game of Thrones had revealed its deepest secret, the hidden reality that connected every move on the board to forces that existed beyond the physical universe. The real conflict was not between competing political factions, but between the fundamental principles that governed all existence, and the outcome of that conflict would determine whether life and hope and love would continue to shine in a cosmos that was slowly being consumed by the cold darkness that awaited all things at the end of time. The Great Hall of Dragonstone had been transformed into something that resembled both a war council and a gathering of mystics, its ancient walls bearing witness to conversations that would have been dismissed as madness by those who lived in the comfortable ignorance of the world above. Representatives from every corner of the known world had answered the call sent out by the Council of Guardians, scholars and priests and warriors who had dedicated their lives to understanding and opposing the cosmic forces that threatened all existence. From the Summer Isles came a priestess whose skin bore the ritual scars of one who had communed directly with the forces of creation, her eyes holding depths of knowledge that spoke of visions granted by powers that existed beyond the physical realm. She had brought with her scrolls written on parchment made from the bark of trees that had stood since the dawn of the world, documents that contained prophecies and warnings passed down through generations of those who served the light. The representative from Korth was a warlock whose pale lips were stained blue by the wine of the warlocks, but his allegiance was not to the corrupt sorcerers who ruled the House of the Undying, but to older and purer traditions that had existed in that ancient city since before the rise of the Valyrian freehold. He carried with him a collection of glass candles that burned with flames of different colors, each one attuned to a different aspect of the magical forces that flowed through the world like hidden rivers beneath the surface of apparent reality. From the far east, beyond even the lands that maps dared to chart, had come a monk whose robes were woven from silk that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. He spoke little, but when he did speak, his words carried the weight of wisdom gathered from libraries that contained knowledge preserved since the long night's first coming. His presence alone seemed to alter the very air of the chamber, filling it with a sense of peace and purpose that made even the most disturbing revelations easier to bear. But perhaps most surprising of all was the representative from the Iron Islands, a drowned priest whose devotion to the drowned god had led him to discoveries that connected the old gods of the sea to the cosmic forces that the other guardians served. He had brought with him artifacts recovered from the deepest trenches of the ocean, objects that had been preserved beneath the waves since the time when the first men had crossed the arm of dawn and brought their primitive understanding of good and evil to a land that had known only the eternal struggle between creation and destruction. The archivist sat among these gathered representatives of ancient wisdom, his mind still reeling from the revelations that had been shared with him in the deepest vaults beneath the castle. The chronicle of the eternal war lay open before him, its pages glowing softly in the colored light cast by the warlock's glass candles, its words seeming to shift and change, as though the very act of reading them was causing new truths to emerge from the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The Keeper of the Flame stood at the head of the great table that dominated the hall's center, her ancient hands resting upon a collection of artifacts that represented the combined efforts of guardians who had worked in secret for thousands of years. Each object pulsed with its own inner rhythm, creating a harmony of magical energies that seemed to resonate with the very foundations of the castle itself. "The time of hiding is ending," she announced, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall. "The enemy's strategy has achieved its first great objective with the fall of the Targaryen dynasty, but that very success has created opportunities that we must seize if there is to be any hope of ultimate victory. The barriers between the worlds are thinning, the ancient protections are failing, and soon the final battle between light and darkness will begin in earnest." The priestess from the Summer Isles leaned forward, her scarred hands moving in gestures that seemed to channel forces beyond mortal understanding. "The songs of my people speak of a time when the stars will bleed and the sea will boil, when the children of light will face their greatest test and either achieve transcendence or fall into eternal darkness. That time approaches with the speed of storm winds across the narrow sea." The warlock from Karth nodded gravely and gestured toward one of his glass candles, its flame shifting from blue to green to gold as it reflected his inner sight. "The House of the Undying has been corrupted by the enemy's influence, its ancient wisdom twisted to serve purposes of entropy and despair. But there are other sources of knowledge in my city, older traditions that have been preserved by those who understand the true nature of the forces at work in the world. The prophecies speak of dragons returning to the world, but not as conquerors or destroyers. They will come as healers, as forces of renewal that will restore the balance that has been disrupted." The monk from the distant east spoke for the first time since the gathering had begun, his voice carrying the calm authority of one who had achieved perfect understanding of his place in the cosmic order. "In the lands beyond the shadow, we have preserved knowledge of the first war between light and darkness, the conflict that shaped the very laws of physics and established the patterns that govern all existence. The enemy we face is not unique to this world, but is instead one manifestation of a principle that exists wherever life has dared to challenge the supremacy of entropy and death." The drowned priest's contribution came in the form of a song, a chant that seemed to emerge from the depths of the ocean itself and speak of truths that predated human civilization. The melody was haunting and beautiful, filled with the sound of waves breaking against ancient shores and the cry of seabirds that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. As the various representatives shared their knowledge and insights, a picture began to emerge that was both more hopeful and more terrifying than anything the archivist had previously imagined. The enemy's victory over the Targaryens had indeed been a devastating blow to the forces of light, but it had not been the decisive triumph that the Night King had intended. Instead, it had triggered a series of events that were already beginning to restore the cosmic balance that had been disrupted. The exile of Daenerys Targaryen to the eastern continent had not been a random consequence of political upheaval, but had instead been guided by forces that understood the necessity of removing the last dragon blood from a realm that was no longer safe for those who carried such precious genetic heritage. In the lands across the narrow sea, she would be shaped and tested and prepared for the role she would ultimately play in the restoration of the eternal balance. More importantly, the destruction of the old order in Westeros had created opportunities for new alliances and new strategies that would have been impossible while the Targaryens still ruled from the Iron Throne. The various factions that were emerging from the chaos of civil war would eventually coalesce around individuals who possessed the strength and wisdom necessary to face the ultimate threat, though most of them would not understand their cosmic significance until the final battle was already upon them. The Chronicler of Shadows spread across the table a collection of maps that showed not just the geography of the known world, but the flow of magical energies that connected every sacred site and ancient stronghold. The patterns revealed by these maps were breathtaking in their complexity and beauty, creating geometric designs that spoke of intelligence and purpose operating on scales that dwarfed human understanding. The enemy's greatest mistake, he explained, as he traced the lines of force with his finger, was assuming that the destruction of the Targaryen dynasty would permanently disrupt the network of magical protections that had guarded the realm for centuries. But the dragons were never the source of that power, merely its most visible manifestation. The true strength of the protections lies in the land itself, in the sacred sites and ancient strongholds that have been accumulating magical energy since the world was young. The speaker for the Flame added her own insights to the growing understanding, her voice carrying the musical cadence of prophecy fulfilled. The fires of Ruler burn brighter now than they have in centuries, responding to the approach of the final darkness. The Lord of Light is not a god in the conventional sense, but is instead the personification of the creative force itself, the principle of existence that stands in eternal opposition to the entropy and despair that the enemy represents. As the night wore on, as the representatives shared knowledge that had been preserved in secret for millennia, the archivist began to understand his own role in the cosmic struggle that was approaching its climax. He was not simply a scholar who had stumbled upon dangerous truths, but was instead a vital component in a strategy that had been developing for centuries, a living repository of knowledge that would be needed when the final battle between light and darkness began. The seeing stone that he carried, the prophecies he had copied, the artifacts he had studied, all of them were pieces of a vast puzzle that was finally beginning to reveal its complete picture. The Mad King's visions had not been random glimpses of possible futures, but had instead been carefully selected revelations designed to prepare the Guardians for the choices they would need to make when the fate of all existence hung in the balance. But perhaps most importantly, the gathering had revealed that he was not alone in carrying the burden of cosmic knowledge. Throughout the world, in every culture and civilization that had ever existed, there were those who understood the true nature of the forces at work beneath the surface of apparent reality. The enemy was vast and patient and possessed of intelligence that spanned millennia, but the forces of light were equally eternal and equally committed to the preservation of life and hope and love in a universe that seemed determined to extinguish them. The priestess from the Summer Isles stood and began to sing, her voice joining with that of the drowned priest to create a harmony that seemed to resonate with the very foundations of the castle. The song they sang was older than human memory, a melody that had been preserved since the dawn of consciousness itself, and as their voices rose and fell together, the artifacts on the table began to pulse with increased intensity. The warlock from Koth added his own voice to the growing chorus, chanting in a language that predated the rise of Valyria, and spoke of truths that existed beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding. The monk from the distant east contributed a humming that seemed to emerge from the depths of his soul, a sound that carried within it the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of those who had dedicated their lives to the service of the light. As the voices blended together, as the ancient songs created harmonies that had not been heard since the last time the forces of light had gathered to face the ultimate darkness, the archivist felt a transformation beginning within himself. The knowledge he had gathered, the truths he had uncovered, the burdens he had accepted, all of them were being woven together into something greater than the sum of their parts. He was becoming more than a simple scholar or seeker of truth. He was becoming a guardian in the truest sense, a keeper of knowledge that would be essential for the survival of all existence. The Mad King's prophecies were not just historical curiosities, but were instead tactical intelligence that would guide the final battle between creation and destruction. The gathering of wisdom was complete, but the real work was just beginning. The forces of light had revealed their plans and shared their knowledge, but now they would need to return to their various corners of the world and begin the delicate work of preparing for a war that would be fought not just with armies and weapons, but with the fundamental forces that governed all reality. The Game of Thrones had been revealed as merely the opening move in a cosmic conflict that would determine whether the universe would continue to expand and create and explore new possibilities, or would instead collapse into the cold silence that had existed before the first spark of consciousness had dared to question the supremacy of eternal night. The next moves in that game would determine the fate of every star and every world and every living thing that had ever dared to hope for something better than endless darkness. The moment of ultimate revelation came not with thunderous proclamations or cosmic displays of power, but with the simple act of placing 7 ancient artifacts upon the star-shaped pattern that had been carved into the floor of Dragonstone's most sacred chamber. Each artifact had been carried across vast distances by the gathered representatives, preserved through centuries of hiding and secrecy, waiting for the moment when they could finally be brought together to reveal the truth that lay at the heart of all existence. The archivist watched in awe as the keeper of the flame arranged the artifacts with the precision of one who had performed this ritual countless times in preparation. Though this was the first occasion when all 7 pieces had been present in the same place since the long night's first ending 8,000 years before. Each object pulsed with its own inner rhythm, but as they were positioned at the points of the carved star, their individual energies began to synchronize into a harmony that seemed to resonate with the very foundations of reality itself. The first artifact was a crystal of impossible clarity that had been brought from the Summer Isles, a fragment of the first light that had ever shone in the darkness and banished the primordial void that had existed before creation began. It hummed with frequencies that spoke directly to the soul, carrying within its crystalline structure the memory of the moment when consciousness first dared to question the supremacy of eternal night. The second was a sphere of metal that seemed to shift between silver and gold as it caught the light from different angles, crafted by the Valyrian dragonlords from ore that had been mined in the heart of the 14 flames before the doom transformed paradise into a hellscape of glass and ash. Within its polished surface, images flickered and danced, showing glimpses of futures that might yet come to pass if the right choices were made by those who possessed the courage to stand against the approaching darkness. From Koth had come a mirror of black glass that reflected not the physical forms of those who looked into it, but the true nature of their souls, revealing the light or darkness that burned within the deepest chambers of the heart. The warlock who had carried it across half the world had warned that few could look into its depths without being forever changed by what they saw there, but the archivist found that he was no longer afraid of such transformations. The monk from the distant east had contributed a book that seemed to be made of light itself, its pages glowing with inner fire that illuminated truths written in languages that had been spoken before the first human had learned to make marks upon clay or stone. The text shifted and changed as it was read, adapting itself to the understanding of each reader and revealing only as much truth as their minds could safely contain. The drowned priest had brought from the depths of the ocean a conch shell that sang with the voices of all those who had ever sacrificed themselves for the preservation of life and hope and love. Its melody was haunting and beautiful, filled with the sorrow of necessary loss, but also with the joy of knowing that such sacrifices had meaning that transcended the individual lives that had been given. The sixth artifact was one that the archivist himself had carried from the ruins of old Valyria, though he had not realized its significance until this moment. It was a simple ring of dragon bone, carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and move in the colored light cast by the other artifacts. The keeper had identified it as one of the 7 seals, objects that had been created to bind the cosmic forces in balance and prevent either light or darkness from achieving absolute dominion. The final artifact was the most precious and dangerous of all, a fragment of the heart of winter itself, the source of the Night King's power and the wellspring from which all entropy and despair ultimately flowed. It had been captured during the first long night by heroes whose names had been deliberately forgotten to protect them from the enemy's eternal vengeance, and its presence in the chamber filled the air with a cold that spoke of endings and the silence that awaited all things at the conclusion of time. As the 7 artifacts took their positions at the points of the carved star, the chamber was filled with energies that made the air itself seem to thicken and pulse with the rhythm of a vast heartbeat. The walls began to glow with soft radiance that revealed hidden carvings and symbols that had been invisible in ordinary light, patterns that spoke of the cosmic forces that governed all existence and the eternal struggle between creation and destruction. But it was the floor itself that underwent the most dramatic transformation. The star pattern began to emit light that rose from the stone like fog from a still pond, creating a 3-dimensional map that showed not just the geography of the known world, but the flow of magical energies that connected every sacred site and ancient stronghold across vast distances. The map was breathtaking in its complexity and beauty, revealing patterns that spoke of intelligence and purpose operating on scales that dwarfed human comprehension. The Keeper of the Flames stepped into the center of the star, her ancient form seeming to gain new vitality as the energies flowed around her like visible streams of liquid light. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that had not been heard since the world was young, frequencies that resonated with the fundamental forces that shaped reality itself. "Behold the truth that has been hidden since the dawn of consciousness," she intoned, her words causing the map to shift and change, revealing new layers of meaning with each syllable. The conflict between light and darkness is not a battle between opposing armies, but a fundamental aspect of existence itself, the tension between order and chaos that allows consciousness to emerge from the void and dare to dream of permanence. The map showed the archivist visions that made his previous glimpses of cosmic truth seem like fragments of a vast tapestry finally revealed in its entirety. He saw the universe as it truly was, not a collection of isolated worlds spinning through empty space, but a living entity whose every component was connected to every other component through networks of energy and consciousness that transcended the boundaries of time and space. The Night King was revealed not as a singular entity, but as one manifestation of a principle that existed throughout the cosmos, the embodiment of entropy, and ending that served as the necessary counterbalance to the forces of creation and growth. Without the darkness, there could be no light. Without death, there could be no appreciation of life. Without the possibility of failure, there could be no meaning in success. But the vision also showed him something else, something that filled his heart with wonder and terror in equal measure. The eternal conflict was not a meaningless struggle between equally powerful forces, but was instead a cosmic process of selection and refinement, a mechanism by which consciousness evolved and grew stronger through the challenges it faced. Each victory over the darkness, each successful defense of light and life and hope, pushed the universe a little further along the path toward some ultimate destination that lay beyond mortal understanding. The Mad King's prophecies were revealed in their true context as fragments of a vast strategic plan that had been developing for millions of years, guidance provided by intelligences that existed on levels of reality that transcended individual consciousness. Ares had not been receiving random visions of possible futures, but had instead been chosen to serve as a conduit for information that would be essential for the next phase of the cosmic struggle. The seeing stone that the archivist carried began to resonate with the energies flowing through the chamber, its crystalline depths revealing visions that connected every fragment of knowledge he had gathered into a coherent picture of what was coming and what would be required to face it successfully. He saw the return of dragons to the world, not as instruments of conquest, but as living embodiments of the creative force itself, vessels through which the power of life could manifest in the physical realm. He saw the bastard of Winterfell, no longer a boy but a man grown, standing at the wall as the final darkness gathered beyond its ancient stones. But Jon Snow was not alone in his vigil, was surrounded by allies whose diverse backgrounds and abilities represented the full spectrum of resistance that the forces of light could marshal against the approaching storm. Most remarkably, he saw Daenerys Targaryen in the lands across the narrow sea, her dragon children growing strong and fierce as they prepared for the flight that would carry them back to Westeros when the final battle began. But her destiny was not to rule from the Iron Throne, was instead something far more significant and far more dangerous than mere political power. The vision showed him the moment when she would be called upon to make the ultimate sacrifice, to give up not just her life, but her very existence as an individual consciousness in order to become a conduit for forces that could push back the darkness and restore the cosmic balance that had been disrupted. Her dragons would be transformed in that moment from mere beasts into living stars, sources of light and warmth that would shine in the darkness long after the physical world had been consumed by entropy and time. But perhaps most important of all, the vision revealed the role that he himself would play in the final struggle. The knowledge he had gathered, the artifacts he had studied, the connections he had made, all of them were preparation for the moment when he would be called upon to serve as the keeper of memory, the guardian who would preserve the essential truths through the chaos of the final battle and ensure that they survived to guide whatever new civilization emerged from the ashes of the old. The chronicler of shadows moved to stand beside the keeper at the center of the star, his weathered hands glowing with the same energies that flowed through the ancient stones. "The enemy's strategy is revealed at last," he said, his voice carrying the authority of one who had spent decades studying the patterns of corruption and influence. "The Night King seeks not merely to conquer the world of the living, but to fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself, to tip the cosmic balance so far toward entropy and despair that creation itself becomes impossible." The speaker for the flame added her own insights to the growing revelation, her scarred hands moving in gestures that seemed to channel the fundamental forces of existence. But the enemy has made a crucial error in judgment. By revealing the full scope of his plans, by showing us the ultimate stakes for which this game is being played, he has also revealed the keys to his own defeat. The darkness is strong, but it is not stronger than the combined light of all who dare to hope for something better than eternal night. The representative from the Summer Isles began to sing again, but this time her voice was joined by all the others present, creating a harmony that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of space and time. The song they sang was older than human memory, a melody that had been preserved since the first consciousness had dared to question the supremacy of the void. And as their voices rose and fell together, the artifacts on the star began to pulse with increased intensity. The energy building in the chamber reached a crescendo that made the air itself seem to sing with harmonics that spoke directly to the soul. The map of the world expanded beyond the confines of the physical realm, showing connections that linked every conscious entity across vast distances and revealing the network of light that stood ready to oppose the approaching darkness. In that moment of perfect clarity, the archivist understood that the Game of Thrones had always been about much more than political power or personal ambition. It had been a reflection of the cosmic struggle that raged beneath the surface of apparent reality, a training ground where the souls of mortals were tested and refined and prepared for the roles they would ultimately play in the final battle between creation and destruction. The Mad King's apparent madness had been the sanest response possible to the knowledge of what was coming, his prophecies the most important strategic intelligence ever gathered by the forces of light. The conspiracy that had destroyed his dynasty had indeed been a devastating blow, but it had also triggered a series of events that were already beginning to restore the cosmic balance that had been disrupted. The war was far from over, but for the first time since beginning his quest for truth, the archivist felt genuine hope that the forces of light might yet prevail against the eternal darkness. The enemy was vast and patient and possessed of intelligence that spanned millennia, but consciousness itself was older and stronger and more creative than any force that sought to snuff it out. The final battle was approaching, but it would be fought by heroes who understood the true nature of what they defended and why their sacrifice would echo through eternity, adding their own light to the cosmic flame that burned at the heart of all existence and refused to be extinguished by any darkness, no matter how absolute it might appear. The aftermath of the great revelation left the chamber beneath Dragonstone, transformed in ways that transcended the merely physical, its ancient stones now pulsing with energies that had been awakened by the gathering of the 7 artifacts and the cosmic truths they had revealed. The archivist stood at the center of the star-shaped pattern, his consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of his individual existence to encompass awareness of the vast network of light that connected every conscious being across the known world and beyond. But it was the final vision that emerged from the Seeing Stone, the ultimate prophecy that Eris had seen in his final moments of life, that provided the resolution to mysteries that had haunted the archivist since the beginning of his quest. The Mad King's last sight had not been of his own death at Jaime Lannister's hands, but had instead been a glimpse of hope that stretched far into the future. A vision of dragons hatching from stone eggs in the flames of a funeral pyre lit by one whose blood carried within it the accumulated power of 40 centuries of Valyrian sorcery. Daenerys Targaryen, the last daughter of the Dragon Kings, would not remain in exile forever. The prophecy showed her return to Westeros, not as a conqueror seeking to reclaim her family's throne, but as something far more significant, a living embodiment of the creative force itself, preparing to face the ultimate darkness. Her dragons would be more than weapons or symbols of power. They would be vessels through which the fundamental energies of creation could manifest in the physical world. The vision revealed the precise moment when the cosmic balance would be restored, when the forces of light and darkness would meet in final confrontation on the fields where winter met eternal spring. Jon Snow would stand at the center of that battle, his true parentage finally revealed as the product of a union that had been prophesied since the world was young. The song of ice and fire made flesh through the joining of Stark and Targaryen bloodlines. But the resolution of the cosmic conflict would require sacrifices that would test the very foundations of love and loyalty and hope. The vision showed the archivist moments of transcendent beauty and terrible sorrow. Heroes who would give up everything they held dear to preserve the possibility that consciousness itself might survive the final darkness and emerge into a new dawn that would be brighter than any that had come before. The Keeper of the Flame. moved through the chamber like a figure from legend made manifest, her ancient form seeming to gain new vitality with each step as the cosmic energies flowed through her being. She had been present at the first long night's ending, had witnessed the original binding of the cosmic forces in precarious balance, and now she would live to see the completion of the great work that had been begun in the youth of the world. The Mad King's final vision was not of death, but of birth, she explained, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequencies of creation itself. In the moment when Jaime Lannister's sword pierced his heart, Aerys saw across the barriers of time to witness the hatching of dragons in Essos, the moment when the blood of old Valyria would once again be joined with the fire that burns at the heart of all existence. The Chronicler of Shadows spread across the table a collection of documents that had been hidden in the deepest vaults of Dragonstone since the conquest, records that revealed the true purpose behind Aegon's invasion of Westeros 3 centuries before. The Targaryen conquest had not been motivated by simple ambition or the desire for power, but had instead been a carefully planned strategic maneuver designed to position the Guardians of Light in the place where the final battle would ultimately be fought. Every major event in the history of the Seven Kingdoms has been shaped by knowledge of what was coming, the chronicler explained as he traced patterns on maps that showed the flow of magical energies across the continent. The building of the wall, the establishment of the Night's Watch, the preservation of the Stark bloodline in the frozen north, all of it was preparation for the moment when the eternal conflict would enter its final phase. The speaker for the Flame added her own insights to the growing understanding, her voice carrying the musical cadence of prophecy revealed. The enemy's greatest mistake was assuming that the destruction of the Targaryen dynasty would eliminate the threat posed by dragon blood. But consciousness is not so easily destroyed, and the genetic heritage that carried the power of the Valyrian Dragonlord survived in exile, protected by forces that the Night King did not fully understand. The representative from the Summer Isles began to hum a melody that seemed to emerge from the very stones of the chamber, a song that spoke of cycles within cycles, of endings that were actually beginnings in disguise. Her people had preserved knowledge of the last time the cosmic balance had been restored, memories of heroes who had given everything to ensure that light would continue to shine in the darkness. The patterns repeat, but they also evolve, she said, her words carrying the wisdom of countless generations who had watched the eternal dance between creation and destruction. Each time the forces of light faced the ultimate test, they emerged stronger and more refined, more capable of preserving consciousness against the entropy that seeks to reduce all things to cold silence. The warlock from Karth contributed his own understanding to the collective wisdom that was assembling like pieces of a vast puzzle, finally revealing its complete picture. His pale lips curved in a smile that held no trace of the madness that usually marked those who trafficked in the mystical arts, only the profound peace that came from understanding one's place in the cosmic order. The glass candles burn brighter now than they have in 1,000 years, he observed, gesturing toward the artifacts that still pulsed with otherworldly energy. The magical forces that were suppressed during the Age of Iron and rational thought are returning to the world, awakening powers that will be needed for the final confrontation between order and chaos. The monk from the distant east spoke of the libraries that existed beyond the edges of all maps, repositories of knowledge that contained the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that had faced the same cosmic threats on other worlds beneath other stars. His words painted pictures of victories that had been achieved through sacrifice and loss, but also of the transcendent beauty that emerged when consciousness chose love over fear in the face of ultimate darkness. The enemy's power lies in convincing beings that their individual existence is all that matters, he explained, his voice carrying the calm authority of one who had achieved perfect understanding of the illusory nature of separation. But consciousness is not limited to individual forms, and when enough beings choose to sacrifice their personal desires for the preservation of the whole, they become part of something greater than the sum of their parts. The drowned priest's contribution came in the form of a story, a tale that had been passed down through generations of those who served the sea and understood its ancient wisdom. He spoke of depths that held treasures beyond counting, of pressures that transformed ordinary substances into forms of crystalline beauty, of currents that connected every drop of water to every other drop across vast oceans. The drowned god teaches that death is not ending but transformation, he said, his voice carrying the rhythm of waves breaking against eternal shores. What appears to be loss is actually the price of participation in something that transcends individual existence, the cost of becoming part of the eternal current that flows through all things. As the various representatives shared their wisdom and insights, the archivist began to understand the true resolution of the mystery that had driven his quest from the beginning. The Mad King had not been destroyed by madness, but had instead been transformed by knowledge too vast for any individual consciousness to contain. His apparent ravings had been attempts to communicate truths that could only be fully understood by minds that had been prepared through years of careful study and gradual revelation. The prophecies scattered throughout his hidden archives were not random warnings about future disasters, but were instead components of a vast strategic plan that had been developing for millennia. Each vision, each fragment of foreseen events was a piece of tactical intelligence that would guide the final battle between creation and destruction. The seeing stone pulsed with renewed energy as the archivist focused his thoughts upon it, its crystalline depths revealing the complete scope of what Ares had seen and understood in his final years. The Mad King had witnessed not just the immediate events that would follow his death, but had seen across the centuries to the moment when the cosmic balance would finally be restored. The vision showed him the exact sequence of events that would lead to victory, the precise choices that would need to be made by individuals who might not even understand the cosmic significance of their actions. Jon Snow would need to embrace his true heritage as the song of ice and fire made flesh, accepting the burden of leadership even though it would cost him everything he had ever loved. Daenerys would need to transcend her desire for the Iron Throne and accept her role as the vessel through which the creative force would manifest in the physical world. But perhaps most importantly, the vision revealed the role that knowledge itself would play in the final victory. The truth that the archivist had gathered, the wisdom that the Council of Guardians had preserved, the artifacts that had been protected through centuries of hiding and secrecy, all of it would be essential for ensuring that the light's victory would be permanent rather than temporary. The enemy's greatest weapon had always been ignorance, the ability to operate in shadows while its opponents remained unaware of the true nature of the threat they faced. But the gathering of knowledge, the revelation of cosmic truths, the understanding of the fundamental forces at work beneath the surface of apparent reality, all of this had created a foundation for resistance that could not be easily undermined or corrupted. The Game of Thrones was ending, but the real war that would follow would be fought by heroes who understood exactly what they were defending and why their sacrifice would echo through eternity. The Mad King's prophecies would guide them, the ancient artifacts would empower them, and the wisdom of ages would sustain them through the darkness that would precede the final dawn. The Keeper of the Flame gestured toward the 7 artifacts that still pulsed with cosmic energy at the points of the carved star, her ancient eyes reflecting depths of hope that had been nurtured through centuries of patient waiting. "The resolution is at hand," she announced, her words causing the chamber itself to ring like a bell cast from the music of the spheres. "The knowledge has been gathered, the wisdom has been shared, and the heroes who will fight the final battle are already being prepared for the roles they will play." The archivist felt the weight of cosmic responsibility settling upon his shoulders like a cloak woven from starlight and dreams. But it was a burden that he accepted with joy rather than resignation. The Mad King's quest for truth had been completed, his prophecies had been preserved and understood, and his sacrifice had not been in vain. The darkness was still approaching. The final battle was yet to be fought, but for the first time since the long night's ending, the forces of light were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The eternal conflict between creation and destruction would soon enter its final phase, but consciousness itself had never been stronger or more determined to preserve the possibility of hope in a universe that trembled on the edge of either transcendence or oblivion. The revelation of the cosmic struggle's true nature had provided answers to the greatest mysteries that had driven the archivist's quest, but it had also revealed the existence of a conspiracy so vast and so deeply rooted in the institutions of civilized society that its full scope was almost impossible to comprehend. As the energy summoned by the 7 artifacts slowly subsided, and the chamber beneath Dragonstone returned to something approaching its normal state, the gathered representatives began to share knowledge of the enemy's earthly servants, the network of corruption that had been carefully cultivated over thousands of years. The Citadel itself, that great beacon of learning and rational thought that had guided the progress of knowledge throughout the 7 kingdoms, had been compromised at its very foundations by influences that most of its members did not even recognize. The Keeper of the Flame spread across the table a collection of documents that bore the seal of the Seneschal, records that revealed how the systematic suppression of magical knowledge had been orchestrated not by rational skepticism, but by deliberate policy designed to weaken the realm's defenses against supernatural threats. "The Grey Rats have served their purpose well," she said, her voice heavy with the sorrow of betrayal by those who should have been allies in the struggle against darkness. For centuries, they have worked to eliminate the old knowledge, to replace wisdom with mere information, to convince the world that the forces they cannot measure or quantify simply do not exist. Each book they have burned, each tradition they have dismissed as superstition, each bloodline they have allowed to die out has served the enemy's ultimate goals. The Chronicler of Shadows produced a ledger that contained names and dates spanning 3 centuries, a careful record of the Meisters who had been most active in suppressing magical knowledge and the suspicious circumstances that had surrounded their rise to positions of influence within the Citadel's hierarchy. Many of the names were familiar to the archivist from his years of study, scholars whose reputations for wisdom and learning had made them legendary figures in the academic world. "The corruption is subtle but pervasive," the chronicler explained as he traced patterns of influence that connected seemingly unrelated events across decades of careful manipulation. "The enemy does not work through obvious servants or blatant displays of malevolent power, but through the slow, patient subversion of those who believe themselves to be serving good and rational causes. A maester who burns a book of prophecies because he believes it to be dangerous superstition, a lord who abandons the old traditions because he wishes to appear modern and enlightened, a septon who preaches against the ancient ways because he thinks they threaten the purity of his faith. All of them serve the darkness without ever realizing the true nature of what they do." The faith of the 7, that great religious institution that had provided spiritual guidance to millions of believers throughout the centuries, had proven to be equally susceptible to the enemy's corrupting influence. The Speaker for the Flame produced a scroll written in the ancient tongue of Old Valyria, a document that revealed how the original 7-pointed star had been a symbol of cosmic balance, representing the harmony between opposing forces that kept the universe stable and allowed consciousness to flourish. "The faith that exists now is a shadow of what it once was," she explained, her scarred hands moving in gestures that seemed to channel the fundamental forces of creation. The original teachings spoke of balance and harmony, of the need to respect both light and darkness as necessary components of a greater whole. But those teachings have been gradually replaced by doctrines that emphasize conflict and domination, that seek to eliminate the darkness rather than maintain the balance that keeps both forces in check. The representative from the Summer Isles added her own insights to the growing picture of corruption and manipulation, speaking of how the enemy's influence had spread even to the most remote corners of the known world. Her people had preserved memories of the time when all the various faiths and traditions had been connected by common understanding of the cosmic forces at work, but those connections had been systematically severed by influences that promoted division and misunderstanding. The enemy's greatest victory has been convincing the various servants of light that they are enemies of each other, she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of countless generations who had witnessed the slow fragmentation of what had once been a unified resistance to the forces of entropy and despair. The followers of Rulor dismiss the old gods as primitive superstition, the Septons condemn the Red Priests as dangerous heretics, the Meisters reject all forms of mystical knowledge as backwards thinking. Each group believes itself to be the sole guardian of truth, never realizing that they are all fighting the same enemy and serving the same ultimate cause. The warlock from Koth spoke of the corruption that had consumed his own city, describing how the House of the Undying had been transformed from a repository of ancient wisdom into a trap for the unwary, its blue-lipped sorcerers serving masters that they did not understand. The glass candles that had once provided clear sight across vast distances now showed visions tainted by the enemy's influence, leading seekers of truth down paths that ended in madness or despair. The enemy's strategy is to corrupt from within rather than attack from without, he explained, his pale lips curved in an expression of profound sadness. By taking control of the very institutions that should be defending against the darkness, by turning teachers into destroyers and protectors into betrayers, the Night King has achieved victories that no army could have won through direct assault. The monk from the distant east contributed his own understanding of how the corruption had spread across the world, describing libraries that had been deliberately destroyed not by conquerors, but by their own keepers, schools of mystical knowledge that had been disbanded not by external pressure, but by internal schisms that had been carefully orchestrated by influences operating from the shadows. The pattern is always the same, he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of one who had studied the enemy's methods across multiple civilizations and historical periods. First, doubt is introduced into the minds of those who guard the ancient knowledge. They begin to question whether the old ways are truly necessary, whether the traditional practices serve any real purpose in the modern world. Then, seemingly rational arguments are presented for abandoning the old traditions in favor of new approaches that appear more efficient or more enlightened. The drowned priest's contribution revealed how even the ancient and primal worship of the sea had been touched by the enemy's corrupting influence, with traditions that had once maintained the balance between the tides being replaced by practices that emphasized dominance over the natural world, rather than harmony with its eternal rhythms. What is dead may never die, but it can be turned to serve purposes that betray the very essence of what it once represented, he said, his voice carrying the sound of waves breaking against shores that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. The enemy's greatest weapon is not the power to destroy, but the ability to corrupt, to take what is sacred and twist it into something that serves the opposite of its original purpose. As the various representatives shared their knowledge of how the corruption had spread through every level of society, the archivist began to understand the true scope of the conspiracy that had been working against the forces of light for thousands of years. It was not a simple matter of evil individuals pursuing selfish goals, but was instead a systematic campaign to undermine the very foundations of civilization itself. The great houses of Westeros had not been immune to this influence, with bloodlines that had once served as guardians of ancient knowledge being gradually turned away from their traditional responsibilities. The Starks had maintained their connection to the old gods longer than most, but even they had been slowly distanced from the deeper mysteries that their ancestors had once protected. The Lannisters had been completely corrupted, their pride and ambition exploited to serve purposes that would ultimately destroy everything they claimed to value. Even the Night's Watch, that ancient institution dedicated to defending the realm against the darkness beyond the wall, had been weakened by influences that encouraged the abandonment of old traditions and the adoption of new practices that appeared more rational but were actually less effective. The vows that bound the Brothers in Black had been subtly altered over the centuries, their original meaning diluted until they served more to isolate the Watch from the rest of society than to strengthen their resolve against the approaching threat. The Keeper of the Flame produced a map that showed the extent of the corruption spread across the known world, marking locations where ancient knowledge had been lost or suppressed, where traditional practices had been abandoned, where the connections between the various servants of light had been severed. The pattern revealed by the map was breathtaking in its completeness, showing how the enemy had achieved through patience and subtlety what no direct assault could have accomplished. "The conspiracy is vast, but it is not invincible," she announced, her words causing the artifacts still positioned at the points of the carved star to pulse with renewed energy. "The enemy's greatest strength is also its greatest weakness, for a strategy that depends on secrecy and deception becomes vulnerable once its true nature is revealed and understood." The Chronicler of Shadows nodded in agreement and gestured toward the collection of documents and artifacts that represented centuries of careful investigation and preservation. "The knowledge that we have gathered here tonight represents more than just historical curiosity or academic achievement. It is intelligence that can be used to identify and counter the enemy's agents, to restore the connections that have been severed, to rebuild the defenses that have been systematically undermined." The Speaker for the Flame added her own insights to the growing strategy for resistance, her voice carrying the musical cadence of prophecy transformed into practical action. "The corruption spreads through ignorance and isolation, but it can be countered through knowledge and unity. Each person who learns the truth becomes a potential center of resistance. Each connection that is restored weakens the enemy's ability to divide and manipulate." The representative from the Summer Isles began to sing again, but this time her melody was taken up by voices from across the chamber, creating a harmony that seemed to resonate with the very foundations of the ancient castle. The song they sang was one of healing and restoration, of bonds being renewed and strength being gathered for the challenges that lay ahead. As the voices blended together in ancient harmonies that had been preserved since the first long night's ending, the archivist felt a transformation beginning not just within himself, but throughout the network of connections that linked every conscious being who opposed the forces of entropy and despair. The knowledge that had been shared in this chamber would not remain isolated, but would spread through carefully chosen channels to those who needed to understand the true nature of the threat they faced. The conspiracy that had worked against the light for thousands of years had been revealed at last, its methods exposed and its weaknesses identified. The enemy's strategy of corruption and manipulation could still cause tremendous damage, but it could no longer operate from the shadows, protected by the ignorance of those it sought to destroy. The broader conspiracy had been vast and subtle and patient, but the forces of light had proven to be equally patient and far more creative in their resistance. The Game of Thrones had been revealed as merely one theater in a much larger conflict, but it was a theater where the final act was about to begin, where the choices made by mortal players would determine the fate of all existence. The network of corruption that had taken millennia to construct would not be easily dismantled. But the work of restoration had already begun. Each person who learned the truth, each connection that was renewed, each tradition that was restored, would serve as a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness, a point of light around which the forces of creation could rally for the final battle between order and chaos. The enemy had achieved great victories through patience and subtlety, but consciousness itself was older and stronger and more resilient than any force that sought to extinguish it. The conspiracy had been broad and deep and carefully hidden, but the truth was broader and deeper and more powerful than any lie, no matter how carefully constructed or how long maintained. The war was far from over. But for the first time in centuries, the forces of light understood the true nature of their enemy and possessed the knowledge necessary to counter its most dangerous weapons. The final battle would still require tremendous sacrifice and unimaginable courage, but it would be fought by heroes who understood exactly what they were defending and why their victory would preserve the possibility of hope for all eternity. The knowledge of the vast conspiracy that had been working against the forces of light for millennia cast new illumination upon events that were already unfolding across the Seven Kingdoms, revealing patterns and connections that transformed the chaos of the present into a tapestry of cosmic significance. As dawn broke over Dragonstone, painting the ancient castle's twisted spires with the gold and crimson of a new day, the archivist found himself seeing the world through eyes that had been forever changed by the revelations of the night. The civil war that was tearing the realm apart was not merely a political struggle between competing claimants to the Iron Throne, but was instead the latest manifestation of the eternal conflict between creation and destruction, with each faction representing different aspects of the forces that had been shaping history since the world was young. Robert Baratheon's death had not been a simple hunting accident, but had been the culmination of influences that had been working to remove him from the game board at precisely the moment when his continued presence would have interfered with the enemy's carefully laid plans. The Seeing Stone, now permanently attuned to the cosmic energies that flowed through the chamber beneath Dragonstone, revealed visions of events that were taking place at that very moment across the narrow sea. In the ancient city of Vase Dothrak, where the bones of dead carls lay scattered beneath the stars, a young woman with silver hair and violet eyes stood before a funeral pyre that blazed with flames of unnatural color and intensity. Daenerys Targaryen stepped into the fire that should have consumed her flesh and emerged instead with 3 dragon hatchlings clinging to her naked form, their scales gleaming like jewels in the light of the dying flames. The moment of their hatching sent ripples of power across the magical network that connected every conscious being who served the light, awakening abilities that had lain dormant for centuries and calling heroes to destinies they did not yet understand. In the frozen wastes beyond the wall, where the Night's Watch maintained their ancient vigil against the darkness that gathered in the uttermost north, Jon Snow felt the call even though he did not recognize its source or understand its meaning. The bastard of Winterfell stood upon the wall's ancient ice, his breath forming clouds in the bitter cold as he stared out at wilderness that seemed to stretch to the end of the world. But his true sight penetrated beyond the physical landscape to glimpse the stirring of forces that had slumbered since the long night's ending 8,000 years before. The archivist watched through the Seeing Stone as the young man's hand moved unconsciously to the pommel of his sword, a blade of Valyrian steel that had been passed down through generations of Stark lords and carried within its folded metal the accumulated strength of all who had wielded it in defense of the light. Jon Snow did not yet know his true parentage, did not understand that he was the song of ice and fire made flesh, but the dragon blood that flowed in his veins was already beginning to respond to the call of his newly hatched kin across the narrow sea. The vision shifted to show events unfolding in King's Landing, where the Game of Thrones continued to play out according to patterns that had been established long before any of the current players had been born. Cersei Lannister sat upon the Iron Throne, her golden hair catching the light that streamed through the throne room's high windows, but her apparent triumph was hollow, for she served masters that she did not recognize and pursued goals that would ultimately destroy everything she claimed to love. The enemy's corruption had spread deep into House Lannister's bloodline, twisting their natural pride and ambition into weapons that served the forces of entropy and despair. Tywin Lannister had not been an unwitting pawn, but had instead been a knowing servant of the darkness, his careful accumulation of power and influence serving to position his family as instruments of cosmic destruction. The gold that had built their wealth had been mined from veins that ran deep into the earth's heart, where ancient evils stirred and whispered promises of power to those willing to listen. But the visions also revealed sources of hope that were beginning to emerge from the chaos and destruction that surrounded the struggle for the Iron Throne. In the God's Wood of Winterfell, where the Heart Tree had stood since the dawn of the Age of Heroes, Bran Stark sat in quiet contemplation of mysteries that stretched far beyond the boundaries of ordinary human understanding. The boy who had fallen from the tower and lived had been transformed by his brush with death, awakened to abilities that connected him directly to the network of consciousness that existed beyond the physical realm. The old gods were not deities in the conventional sense, but were instead manifestations of the collective consciousness of all who had ever lived and died in service to the light, their accumulated wisdom preserved in the ancient trees that served as focal points for magical energies that flowed through the world like hidden rivers. Bran's connection to this network was growing stronger with each passing day, preparing him for the role he would play as the keeper of memory when the final battle between creation and destruction began in earnest. The vision showed him Arya Stark in the free city of Braavos, her face bearing no expression as she moved through the shadows like death itself made manifest. But her training with the Faceless Men was not simply preparation for a life of assassination, but was instead a form of spiritual discipline that would allow her to transcend the boundaries of individual identity and become a vessel for forces that operated beyond the confines of personality and ego. The House of Black and White served the many-faced god, but that deity was not the enemy that some believed it to be. Death was not the opposite of life, but was instead its necessary partner, the force that gave meaning to existence by ensuring that it was precious and finite. Arya's journey into the realm of no one and nothing was teaching her to let go of the attachments and illusions that bound consciousness to individual forms, preparing her for the moment when she would need to sacrifice her personal identity to serve the greater cause of preserving life itself. The Seeing Stone revealed similar preparations taking place throughout the Seven Kingdoms and beyond, as heroes who did not yet understand their cosmic significance were shaped and tested and prepared for the roles they would ultimately play. Samwell Tarly delved deep into the archives of the Citadel, his research guided by intuitions that he could not explain, but which led him steadily toward knowledge that would prove essential when the ancient enemy finally revealed itself. Tyrion Lannister wandered the free cities of Essos, his wit and intelligence serving purposes that transcended his conscious understanding as he gathered allies and resources that would be needed for the final confrontation. The dwarf, who had been dismissed and despised by his own family, carried within his twisted form a strength of spirit that made him more valuable than armies, a clarity of vision that could see through deceptions that had fooled wiser men. Even Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, whose reputation for honor had been destroyed by a single act of necessary betrayal, was beginning to understand the true nature of the choice he had made when he drove his sword through Aerys Targaryen's back. The Mad King's final words had not been ravings about wildfire, but had instead been a desperate attempt to communicate a vision of what was coming, a warning that Jaime had been too young and too proud to understand at the time. The visions showed the archivist moments of transcendent beauty and terrible sorrow, heroes rising to meet their destinies while others fell to corruption or despair. The red comet that blazed across the sky was not a portent of doom, but was instead a beacon of hope, a sign that the cosmic forces were beginning to realign themselves for the final battle between order and chaos. In the lands across the narrow sea, where ancient magic stirred and long-dead cities began to show signs of life, Daenerys Targaryen walked among her newly hatched dragons with the confidence of one who had always known that her destiny lay beyond the simple recovery of her family's throne. The mother of dragons was learning to see through eyes that had been touched by fire, to understand that true power lay not in commanding others, but in serving forces greater than any individual will. Her journey back to Westeros would not be a simple matter of conquest and revenge, but would instead be a pilgrimage that would transform her from a mortal woman into something approaching a force of nature itself. Each city she freed from slavery, each chain she broke, each moment of justice she brought to the oppressed would add to her spiritual strength and prepare her for the ultimate sacrifice that would be required when the darkness finally revealed itself. The echoes of the present moment reverberated through the magical network that connected all conscious beings who served the light, creating harmonies that had not been heard since the first long night's ending. The archivist felt those harmonies flowing through his own consciousness, connecting him to heroes he had never met, but whose struggles were part of the same cosmic pattern that had guided his own quest for truth. The knowledge he had gathered, the artifacts he had studied, the connections he had made, all of them were preparation for the moment when he would be called upon to serve as more than just an observer of events. The final battle would require not just warriors and dragons, but also those who understood the deeper significance of what was at stake, who could preserve the essential truths through the chaos and confusion that would inevitably accompany the clash between such fundamental forces. The Game of Thrones was entering its final phase, but the real war that lay beneath the surface of political maneuvering was already beginning to manifest in ways that would soon be impossible to ignore. The enemies that had worked in shadows for millennia were beginning to emerge into the light, forced by the return of dragons and the awakening of ancient powers to abandon their strategies of subtlety and deception. The wall that had protected the realm for 8,000 years was beginning to weaken, its magical foundations strained by forces that had been gathering strength in the frozen wastes beyond its ancient stones. The Night's Watch felt the change, even if they did not understand its significance, their dreams haunted by visions of blue flames and walking corpses and a cold that could freeze the very soul. But for every sign of the approaching darkness, there were also signs of hope that grew stronger with each passing day. The network of light that connected every servant of creation was awakening from its long slumber, preparing to meet the ultimate test of its strength and resilience. The conspiracies that had worked to divide and weaken the forces of good were being exposed and countered by knowledge that could not be suppressed or corrupted. The echoes of the present moment spoke of endings and beginnings intertwined, of losses that would be balanced by discoveries, of sacrifices that would purchase victories beyond the ability of mortal minds to fully comprehend. The Mad King's prophecies were being fulfilled with precision that testified to the cosmic intelligence that had guided their creation, each vision serving as a waypoint on the path toward the final confrontation between light and darkness. The archivist closed his eyes and felt the weight of knowledge settling upon his consciousness like snow falling on a winter landscape, each flake adding to the accumulation that would eventually transform the entire terrain. The quest that had begun with simple scholarly curiosity had revealed itself to be part of a pattern that stretched across the ages, a thread in a tapestry that was finally approaching completion. The echoes of the present moment carried within them the seeds of futures yet to be born, possibilities that would be shaped by the choices made by heroes who understood the true nature of what they defended. The final battle was approaching, but it would be fought by those who had been prepared through lifetimes of testing and refinement, who possessed the strength and wisdom necessary to preserve the light through whatever darkness might come. The final mystery that had eluded even the cosmic revelations shared in the chamber beneath Dragonstone lay not in the past or present, but in the ultimate future that stretched beyond the approaching battle between light and darkness, in the question of what would remain when the eternal conflict finally reached its resolution. As the archivist stood upon the castle's highest tower, watching the sun climb toward its zenith above waters that sparkled like scattered diamonds, the seeing stone in his hands began to pulse with energies that spoke of visions more profound than any he had yet witnessed. The stone's crystalline depths revealed glimpses of a future so distant that the very stars had changed their positions in the sky, a time when the immediate crisis of the long night's return would be nothing more than a legend preserved in the memories of beings whose consciousness had transcended the limitations of individual mortality. In that far future, the Seven Kingdoms had been transformed into something that bore little resemblance to the feudal realm that currently struggled with the Game of Thrones. The vision showed him cities of crystal and light that rose from landscapes where the old castles and towns had once stood, their spires reaching toward heavens that blazed with auroras of impossible beauty. The people who inhabited these cities were recognizably human, but had been changed by their experiences with the cosmic forces that flowed through the world. Their consciousness expanded to encompass awareness of the vast network of life that connected every conscious being across infinite distances. The Iron Throne had long since been melted down, and its metal forged into something far more beautiful and far more meaningful, a fountain of liquid fire that served as a focal point for the creative energies that flowed through the transformed realm. The seat of power was no longer a chair of swords that spoke of conquest and domination, but had become a source of life and growth that nourished everything it touched. But it was the fate of the individuals whose struggles had shaped the immediate future that provided the most profound insights into the ultimate meaning of the cosmic conflict. Jon Snow stood at the center of the transformed world, but he was no longer the bastard of Winterfell or even the revealed Targaryen prince, but had instead become something approaching a force of nature itself, a living embodiment of the balance between ice and fire that had been achieved through sacrifice and wisdom. Daenerys Targaryen was present in the vision not as a separate individual but as an integral part of Jon's transformed consciousness, their love having transcended the boundaries of individual identity to become a unified expression of the creative force that shaped reality itself. The dragons that had once been separate beasts had similarly evolved into aspects of their consciousness, living stars that soared through skies of liquid light and brought warmth and growth to worlds that orbited distant suns. The vision revealed that the final battle had indeed been fought and won, but not in the way that any of the participants had expected. Victory had not come through the defeat of the Night King in conventional combat, but through a transformation so profound that the very concepts of victory and defeat had been transcended. The enemy had not been destroyed, but had instead been integrated into a larger harmony, its essential nature as a force of ending and completion serving its proper role in the cosmic order. The archivist watched in wonder as the vision showed him the moment of ultimate transformation, the point at which the eternal conflict between creation and destruction had been resolved, not through the triumph of one over the other, but through the achievement of perfect balance. The Night King had not been evil in any absolute sense, but had instead been playing his necessary role in a cosmic drama that required both light and darkness to reach its intended conclusion. The transformation had required sacrifices beyond anything that mortal minds could easily comprehend. Heroes giving up not just their lives but their very existence as separate beings in order to become part of something infinitely larger and more meaningful. But those sacrifices had not been losses, but had instead been the ultimate form of victory, consciousness choosing to transcend its individual limitations and become part of the eternal dance between order and chaos that shaped all existence. The Keeper of the Flame appeared beside him on the tower, her ancient form seeming almost translucent in the morning light, as though she were already beginning to fade into the larger reality that she had served for so many centuries. Her presence brought with it a sense of completion, of mysteries finally resolved and purposes finally fulfilled. "You see now why the Mad King's final visions were so important," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequencies of creation itself. Aerys saw not just the immediate future, but the ultimate destination toward which all consciousness is evolving, the moment when the eternal conflict would be transformed into eternal harmony. The Chronicler of Shadows emerged from the tower's stairwell, carrying with him the Chronicle of the Eternal War and other documents that represented the accumulated wisdom of ages. His weathered hands trembled as he opened the ancient tome to pages that the archivist had not seen before, entries that had been written not by past Targaryen kings, but by the cosmic intelligences that guided the evolution of consciousness itself. The final mystery is not what will happen during the approaching battle, but what will emerge from its resolution, he explained, his voice heavy with the weight of knowledge that few mortals had ever been permitted to glimpse. The conflict between light and darkness is not eternal in the sense of being endless, but is instead eternal in the sense of being outside time itself, a fundamental aspect of reality that must be resolved before consciousness can evolve to its next stage of development. The speaker for the flame joined them on the tower, her scarred hands glowing with the same energies that flowed through the ancient stones of Dragonstone. She spoke of the transformation that was already beginning in the hearts and minds of those who had been touched by the cosmic forces, the gradual awakening of abilities and awareness that would ultimately allow them to transcend the limitations of individual existence. The heroes who will fight the final battle are not being prepared for death, but for transformation, she said, her words carrying the musical cadence of prophecy revealed. Their sacrifices will not end their existence, but will instead mark the beginning of a new form of consciousness that encompasses the best aspects of both light and darkness, while transcending the conflict between them. The seeing stone pulsed with renewed intensity as the archivist focused his thoughts upon the ultimate question that had driven his quest from the beginning. What was the true purpose behind the cosmic conflict, and what would remain when it was finally resolved? The visions that emerged from the crystal's depths provided answers that were both more wonderful and more terrible than anything he had previously imagined. The purpose of the eternal struggle was not to achieve the victory of good over evil, but to refine consciousness itself, to push it through a process of evolution that would ultimately produce beings capable of transcending the limitations that currently defined existence. Every battle fought between the forces of creation and destruction served to strengthen the quality of consciousness that emerged from the conflict, testing it and purifying it until it achieved a level of development that could survive the transformation into something approaching godhood itself. The cosmic intelligences that guided this process were not external deities, but were instead the evolved consciousness of beings who had successfully completed their own transformation in previous cycles of the eternal conflict. They served as guides and teachers for younger forms of consciousness that were still struggling with the fundamental questions of existence, providing just enough assistance to ensure that the process of evolution continued without interfering so much that the lessons lost their meaning. The Night King himself was revealed to be one of these evolved consciousnesses, playing the role of the ultimate adversary, not out of malevolence but out of love, providing the resistance and challenge that consciousness needed to grow strong enough to transcend its current limitations. His apparent cruelty and destructiveness were actually forms of cosmic compassion, ensuring that only consciousness that had achieved true strength and wisdom would be permitted to advance to the next stage of development. The vision showed the archivist the moment when this truth would be revealed to the heroes who fought the final battle, the point at which Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen and all the others would understand that their enemy had actually been their greatest teacher, that the darkness they had struggled against had been the very force that had given their light its meaning and power. But understanding that truth would require a level of wisdom and maturity that could only be achieved through the process of struggle itself, which was why the cosmic intelligences could not simply reveal it at the beginning of the conflict. Consciousness had to earn its transformation through genuine effort and sacrifice, had to prove that it was ready for the responsibilities that came with transcendence. The final mystery was thus revealed to be not a secret that could be spoken aloud, but a truth that could only be understood through direct experience, a revelation that would emerge naturally from the process of facing the ultimate test with courage and wisdom. The Mad King had seen glimpses of this truth in his final visions, but even he had not been able to fully comprehend its implications while still trapped within the limitations of individual consciousness. The archivist felt his own understanding expanding as the visions continued to unfold, showing him possibilities that stretched far beyond the immediate concerns of the Seven Kingdoms or even the world itself. The cosmic conflict was being played out on countless worlds throughout the universe, each one serving as a training ground for consciousness as it struggled to evolve beyond its current limitations. Some worlds succeeded in achieving the transformation, their consciousness evolving into the cosmic intelligences that guided the process for others. Other worlds failed the test, their consciousness remaining trapped in cycles of conflict and limitation until it finally exhausted itself and faded into the silence that awaited all things that could not transcend their origins. The Seven Kingdoms stood at the crucial moment when their fate would be determined, when the choices made by a handful of individuals would decide whether this world would join the ranks of those that had achieved transcendence or would instead become another cautionary tale of consciousness that had failed to live up to its potential. But the visions also revealed sources of hope that had not been apparent from the perspective of those still trapped within the immediate conflict. The very fact that consciousness had evolved to the point where it could ask these questions, where it could glimpse the larger patterns that governed its existence, was itself evidence that the process was working as intended. The heroes who would fight the final battle had already demonstrated the qualities that would allow them to succeed in achieving the transformation. Their willingness to sacrifice personal desires for larger purposes, proving that they possessed the wisdom necessary to transcend individual limitations. The love between Jon and Daenerys was not merely a romantic attachment, but was instead a foretaste of the unity that would ultimately encompass all consciousness when the transformation was complete. The final mystery thus resolved itself into a truth that was both simple and profound. The purpose of existence was for consciousness to evolve beyond its current limitations and become something capable of transcending the eternal conflict between creation and destruction. The struggles and sacrifices that seemed so terrible from the perspective of individual mortality were actually the necessary steps in a process of cosmic education that would ultimately produce beings capable of shaping reality itself through the power of their evolved consciousness. The archivist understood now that his quest had been guided from the beginning by intelligences that existed beyond the boundaries of individual identity, that every step of his journey had been designed to prepare him for this moment of ultimate revelation. The knowledge he had gathered would not simply be preserved as historical curiosity, but would serve as part of the foundation for the transformation that was approaching. The Game of Thrones would soon reveal its final secret, that it had never been about political power or personal ambition, but had instead been a cosmic drama designed to test consciousness and prepare it for the next stage of its evolution. The players in that game would discover that they had been participating in something far more meaningful than they had ever imagined. Their choices and sacrifices echoing through eternity as part of the process by which the universe itself learned to transcend its limitations and become something approaching perfection. The final mystery was thus not a question to be answered, but a transformation to be experienced, a truth that could only be fully understood by those brave enough to let go of everything they thought they knew about the nature of existence and embrace the possibility of becoming something infinitely greater than they had ever dared to dream. As twilight settled over Dragonstone like a gentle blanket, the archivist found himself alone in the chamber where his quest had reached its completion. The 7 artifacts rested peacefully at their appointed places, their energies flowing in perfect harmony like the breathing of the earth itself. The cosmic truths he had uncovered would guide the final battle between light and darkness, but now there was only peace. The Keeper of the Flame approached with silent steps, her ancient form glowing softly in the candlelight. In her hands she carried a single white candle whose flame contained the accumulated wisdom of ages. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper that carried the weight of eternity. "The knowledge has been preserved, the wisdom has been shared," she said, offering him the sacred flame. "Your quest is complete, but the light you carry will shine forever through whatever darkness may come." The candle's flame danced without any wind to disturb it, casting shadows that moved like gentle dreams across the ancient stones. As the archivist accepted this final gift, he felt his own transformation beginning, the boundaries of his individual existence dissolving into something infinitely larger and more peaceful. The seeing stone in his hands showed him one last vision of the future that awaited beyond all conflict and struggle. He saw worlds where consciousness had evolved into perfect harmony, realms where the eternal dance between creation and destruction had been resolved into cosmic music that played across the stars. The Mad King's prophecies had found their ultimate fulfillment in a universe transformed by love and understanding. The chamber grew quiet as the cosmic energies settled into their eternal rhythms. In that silence, he could hear the gentle echo of all the voices that had ever spoken in service to hope, all the songs that had preserved light through the longest nights, all the dreams that had dared to imagine something better than endless darkness. His quest had begun with scholarly curiosity about a mad king's ravings, but it had revealed itself to be something far greater. The chronicle of hidden truths was complete, but the story it told would echo through eternity, guiding consciousness toward its ultimate destiny among the stars. The archivist walked slowly from the chamber, carrying the sacred flame toward a world that slept beneath the gentle watch of ancient stars. The seven kingdoms dreamed peacefully below, unaware that their deepest mysteries had been revealed and their cosmic purpose understood. The Game of Thrones continued its eternal patterns, but now there were guardians who knew that every move served a greater design. In the distance, the sea whispered against Dragonstone's shores with the rhythm of tides that had flowed since the world was young. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, the same constellations that had witnessed the rise of dragons and the fall of kings that would continue their silent vigil long after the final battle had been fought and won. The Mad King's prophecies lived on in the flame he carried, no longer the ravings of a diseased mind, but the sacred visions of a prophet who had seen across the barriers of time. The light that burned within that candle was the same light that burned in every heart that dared to hope, and it would continue to shine through whatever shadows might fall across the long journey toward transcendence. The chronicle was ended, but the story was eternal. The night was deep, but the dawn that would follow would be brighter than any that had ever come before. And in that promise of light, consciousness found its rest, dreaming dreams of transformation that would carry it gently toward the infinite peace that awaited at the end of all quests.